The following is by Rudolf Steiner. This is from Buddha to Christ lectures. This first one was given in Budapest on May the 31st, 1909. What I have to say here will not involve a religious or philosophical subject, nor will it be a literary or scientific dissertation. I simply want to tell you what spiritual science or occultism, more precisely Rosicrucian occultism, has to say about such great individualities as Buddha and Christ. In a lecture intended for more mature theosophists, I may be allowed to speak more intimately of such truths. Although they will be dealt with in general broader terms, I will also include certain details. Rosicrucian occultism presents one of the great principles of occult theosophical investigation, from which spiritual life should flow into our hearts. Even though the goals and ideals of theosophy can also be found outside the Theosophical Society, there is, however, a difference in the means employed for the attainment and right application of occult knowledge and truth, for occult investigation can and must flow directly into life. Let me illustrate this with a trivial example. It is the same with the human soul as it is with a stove. We do not need to persuade a stove to heat a room because this is its task. The stove does this on its own, provided we put wood into it and light it. Someone might say perhaps that the wood does not know that it is able to give heat, yet it gives heat. By putting some wood, which is so different from the stove, into it and then lighting it, we heat our home. Similarly, in that we become accustomed to spiritual scientific concepts, we acquire an independent judgment and the ability to orientate ourselves independently in the world. It is not our task to preach ideals, but instead to bring fuel to human souls, the fuel of spiritual wisdom, genuine brotherliness, and true humanity. To realize this is our goal. What we designate as the Rosicrucian stream arose in the 13th and 14th centuries, when the spiritual stream of Christianity, because it had taken an external form, was already obscured. The task of Rosicrucianism was to cultivate ancient wisdom. It was the custodian of the treasures of wisdom that came from a primeval world, at a time when Christianity in the outer world was taking on an increasingly superficial and weak form. Wherever such superficial forms and hardened dogmas were taken to be essential, the representatives of spiritual life abjured and cursed those holiest and highest truths that were once venerated in the mysteries. One frequently heard the words, "I curse Scipianus, I curse Buddha, I curse Zarathustra." These are the free names, sacred names of the masters, that were venerated in greatest secrecy in the sanctuaries of the mysteries and the mystery schools of the Rosicrucians. Zarathustra is the same individual as Zarathustra, not the Zarathustra known to history, but the lofty individual who founded the ancient Persian culture and was the teacher in the occult schools of that time. Scipianus was a highly developed individual of ancient times. In one of his subsequent incarnations in Central Asia, he led the occult schools, and in a still later incarnation became the teacher of the esoteric schools of Europe. Buddha or Buddha are one and the same individual. In order to understand what an initiate felt in connection with these three names, and to gain some idea of what they could give him, we must go back in the evolution of humanity and examine the character of Rosicrucian occultism more closely. Let us try to understand it by listening and looking back into the past. More advanced men, who emerged from the masses, existed at all times, and the average people looked up to them reverently as they would to high ideals. To look up to men who had reached a high stage of wisdom and intellectual power stimulated their moral lives and enhanced their living energies. Even today the forces of those lofty spirits flow into our finer bodies. Let us look back into the past to the spiritual individuals of whom I want to speak to you. Let us go back as far as the time of the ancient Indian culture. Even though we can go back in the evolution of humanity still further, to the remote age of Atlantis, when human souls led lives that greatly differed from those of our present lives within physical bodies, we will not deal in detail with that ancient time. Let us try instead to answer the question of how mankind was guided in ancient times, and where the forces came from that influenced men. When a seer, whose spiritual eyes open so that he can read the fine writing of the Akashic Chronicle, looks back into the spiritual worlds, he discovers the sites that were once the sources and fonts of culture and spiritual life. Our souls can discover the sites where the Master assembled his disciples in the mystery schools of that time. There were many such mystery centres on the ancient Atlantean continent. They differed from those of today in name and function, being not merely churches or schools, but a combination of both. Those who searched for truth could find both religion and wisdom in the mystery schools. Here religion and wisdom were one. These cultic centres, the mystery schools, may be characterized by the term Atlantean oracles. They originally were spoken of differently, but this is the name given to them in the European mystery schools. In the centres of wisdom of the Atlantean oracles, spiritual life was differentiated in the same way that external knowledge and the varied professions and trades of external life are subdivided today. The Atlantean oracles contain several branches of spiritual investigation and occult wisdom, but their conditions differed from those of today. In the various oracles, wisdom varied with human capacities and geographical location. A connection existed between certain human capacities and certain planets, that is, certain mystical occult capacities were connected with definite planets. Therefore, on the Atlantean continent, we should distinguish a moon oracle, a Mercury oracle, a Venus oracle, a Sun oracle, a Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn oracle. Our present capacities developed out of the cosmos in the same way in which the Earth developed from it, and these capacities are accordingly connected with different planets and their influences. On Atlantis, the people who were most suited for the development of this or that quality were chosen from the population and assigned to one or the other of the 7 oracles. Of the 7 oracles, which were named, as I've said, after the 7 planets, the Sun oracle stood out from the others, and at the same time the Vulcan oracle was preparing in great secrecy for its future task. Each of these oracles had its origin in the cosmos in accordance with its qualities, but there was one centre in which the capacities cultivated in all 7 centres flowed together. Here the wisdom of the 7 was united. The initiates of this centre, the Holy Sun oracle, had been initiated into the mystery and service of what we today know as the sun, which is only the external expression, or physiognomy, the body and garment, of the spiritual life of a higher being. As is known to all of you, at the time when the sun separated from the earth, the beings who had advanced so far in their development that they could no longer use the earth, beings who had already passed through the human state, abandoned the earth with the physical sun. After the moon had left, the earth was able to become the dwelling place of mankind. If the sun alone had influenced the earth, its development would have been so rapid that human beings would have become old men soon after birth. If only the moon had influenced the earth, human beings would have become rigid mummies. Development would have been too slow, and their bodies would have grown stiff and wooden. Through a wise guidance, sun and moon maintained a balance in the influence they exerted on the earth, so that it and the humans then present were able to develop in a tempo that was most suited to them. The beings of Mars, Mercury, Venus, etc., who for their development did not need the forces that had left the moon and earth, departed with the sun and lived upon it. They continued to be connected with the earth, however, and sent their beneficial forces down to it in the sunlight. A mysterious and occult being is connected with the sun and moon. We shall not speak of him now, but of another who preceded those exalted sun beings, who had advanced so far that they were able to separate themselves from the earth. This being is a leading spirit of the sun. From the sun he sends his spiritual forces down to earth in the same way that the physical light of the sun shines down upon it. The sun rays down light and heat, which draw life out of the earth so that plants can grow and flourish. The works and deeds of a spiritual sun being also stream down to the earth with the physical sunlight. During the old Atlantean epoch, the initiates of the sun oracle had been initiated into the deeds of this lofty sun being. The great initiate, who was the leader of this highest oracle, had undergone the most profound initiation into these mysteries. The entire Atlantean culture went out from him, and, as we shall see, also the post-Atlantean. The Manu, as this leader of the sun oracle was called, though names are unimportant, did not choose the bearers of the post-Atlantean culture from among the so-called scientists and men of learning, nor from among the clairvoyants and magi of that time. Those whom he considered suitable for the task were not men endowed with spiritual and psychic knowledge, men who at that time held positions comparable to those of our modern scientists and professors. Instead, he chose plain people who were gradually losing the clairvoyant faculty. Our present state of consciousness only began to develop at the end of the Atlantean epoch. Then the ancient clairvoyant consciousness was waning, making possible full self-consciousness and the ability to speak of oneself as I. The great Manu gathered about him those who could think intellectually, not the clairvoyants and magi, but those who understood and developed the rudiments of counting and reckoning. They were the despised people who knew nothing at all in the opinions of the leading men. The anthroposophists today are more or less in the same position. Such were the men that Manu gathered about him, and he journeyed with them to the ancient sanctuary from which the post-Atlantean culture was to emanate. Leaving America aside, Europe, Asia, and Africa are populated by the descendants of the ancient Atlanteans who journeyed to these lands under Manu's guidance. This initiate of the sun oracle had then to arrange that the post-Atlantean cultures he had founded and the development of post-Atlantean humanity should take their courses under the influence of the right forces. From the very beginning he had to take care that everything that might prove of value to a future development should be carried over from the past into the future. This is a law of occultism, of spiritual economy, but it can only be known through occultism and spiritual wisdom. This great initiate brought valuable elements from the ancient continent of Atlantis to Europe. To accomplish this, he had first prepared and inspected, as it were, the other oracles. You all know that in the case of ordinary men, the etheric body separates from the astral body and ego soon after death, and gradually dissolves in the universal ether. The same occurs with the astral body after a certain time, but this law is sometimes broken in the interest of spiritual economy. Such was the case with the etheric bodies of the 7 great initiates who were the heads of the ancient Atlantean oracles. What do we mean when we say that we work upon ourselves? We mean that we purify our etheric and astral bodies. Now purified, spiritualized etheric and astral bodies do not dissolve after death, but are preserved in accordance with the law of spiritual economy. It was known in the mysteries how to preserve the valuable etheric and astral bodies developed by great initiates, and it would lead me too far afield to speak of this in detail. These bodies were kept intact in the mystery schools by the preservers. The initiate of the Sun Oracle journeyed to the other Atlantean oracles to collect the 7 etheric bodies of the greatest initiates. These he took along with him. His wisdom attracted a number of people who gathered around him, and under his influence their capacities developed and they gradually grew purer. What followed may be called an art. After a certain time had elapsed, it was possible to incorporate the 7 most important etheric bodies of the 7 greatest initiates of the ancient Atlantean oracles into 7 human beings. In regard to their egos, their power of judgment, etc., they were quite simple people of no importance whatever from an external standpoint. They bore within them, however, the 7 most highly developed etheric bodies of the 7 greatest initiates of Atlantis. These etheric bodies had streamed into them, making it possible for them to send out at certain times, through inspiration from above, the great powerful visions and truths of evolution. Thus they were able to speak of all this exalted wisdom. The great initiates sent these 7 men, these 7 bearers of wisdom, to India, where the people still had a deep comprehension for spiritual things and for the spiritual worlds. In India, the people felt an awareness of the fact that they had once come down from a primeval spiritual world, that they had been born from the bosom of the Godhead. Consequently, the physical world appeared to them as Maya, an illusion, and they longed for the world of the gods, those divine spiritual beings with whom they had once lived. The 7 bearers of wisdom could speak to such people. These 7 men were called the 7 holy rishis. It was they who inaugurated our post-Atlantean culture. The peoples who had left the Atlantean continent, and who were still conscious of the spiritual world and divine spiritual beings. Those peoples who still longed for the spiritual world thus were given the possibility to hear something of it, and to find the way once more leading into it. Other epochs followed that of ancient India. Peoples arose who were not destined to look into the spiritual world, but who wished to contribute to the founding of a new culture. They loved the physical world and did not see it only as Maya or illusion. They began to understand that the physical world is simply the expression and physiognomy of the spiritual world that lies behind it. Such was the second epoch, the ancient Persian or Zarathustran culture. Ordinary history records a Zarathustra who lived much later because historians are unaware that in ancient times it was customary for a successor to adopt the name of a previous leader. The Zarathustra of whom we speak, the greatest Zarathustra, was one of the most intimate disciples of the initiate of the Sun Oracle. It was his task to establish a connection between the physical and spiritual worlds. He had to teach his disciples that the physical sphere of the sun is the body of the spiritual beings who have their abode on the sun, and that the entire physical world should be looked upon as the limbs and members of the physical body of divine spiritual beings. Even as the sun is surrounded by a great aura, so the human being is surrounded by his own small aura, which is a microcosm expression of the sun's great aura. The sun is the body of the sun spirit who revealed himself in the ancient Atlantean sun oracle. He became visible to Zarathustra in clairvoyant vision. Zarathustra designated the aura of the sun as the sun spirit, and this is the same being whom Zarathustra also designated as Ahura Mazda. The occultists of a later time called it Ormons. Zarathustra taught his disciples to see Ahura Mazda in the physical sun, and he taught them not to be led astray by Ahriman. Ahriman has lived in the physical world since the last third of the Atlantean epoch, and attacks the human soul through sense perception, that is to say, from outside. Lucifer, contrariwise, attacks the soul from within. Zarathustra had to kindle in the hearts of men love for the great spirit of the sun. He ignited their feelings by using powerful words, words whose meaning cannot be expressed in modern languages. Everything contained in the Vedas and Gathas, no matter how beautiful, are but a feeble, superficial expression of the great and lofty words originally uttered by Zarathustra. Perhaps they can be expressed in our language as follows. Let me speak to you, so hear and listen, you from near and from afar, who are filled with longing for these words. let me speak to you of the truths that the highest revealed to me, of the truths that he, the great and mighty Ahura Mazda, revealed to me. Hear and listen to me, and mark my words carefully. The teacher who leads you astray, the evil one whose lips bear witness to an evil faith, shall no longer do so, for he, the mighty one, Ahura Mazda, has manifested himself. Evil shall befall those who are not willing to hear my words, as I speak them now, and in the meaning I give them. Evil shall befall them when the course of time reaches its end. At other times Zarathustra declared, "So great and mighty is he who revealed himself to me in the sun, that I willingly surrender everything for him. I willingly sacrifice to him the life of my body, the etheric existence of my senses, the expression of my deeds, the astral body." Such was the vow made by the great Zarathustra. Zarathustra had two disciples. To one of them he revealed through spiritual means everything that could be perceived with the aid of clairvoyant astral organs. This disciple was born again under the name of Hermes, the Egyptian Hermes. To the second disciple he revealed truths that can be known through the clairvoyant etheric body, that is, the wisdom of the Akashic Chronicle. This disciple was Moses, and you may find the wisdom imparted to him in the book of Moses. When the first disciple was born again as Hermes, he bore within him the astral body of Zarathustra, from whom he had obtained not only his teachings, but also his own nature. This was possible, for what he had received was the astral body that Zarathustra had sacrificed. Consequently, Hermes, who was the founder of the third post-Atlantean epoch, proclaimed the wisdom of Zarathustra. The other disciple, to whom Zarathustra had given wisdom through the etheric body, was also born again. When he reincarnated, the etheric body sacrificed by Zarathustra was incorporated within him. This disciple was Moses. These facts can be found in religious documents, but they are recorded in a vowed manner. Read the description of the birth of Moses, for example. What occurred? The child was put into an ark of bulrushes, which floated on the river. What does this mean? It signifies that Moses was completely cut off from the world. His ego and astral body were not to become manifest until they were permeated by the principle of the etheric body. How did this come about? As Moses reposed in the ark, floating on the water, the etheric body embodied with him began to shine forth, and only then were the astral body and ego able to begin their work. Are not the powerful images of Genesis, which will still occupy mankind for a long time to come, images taken from the Akashic Chronicle? These things cannot be understood without the aid of occultism. We now come to the fourth epoch of post-Atlantean culture, to the Greco-Roman epoch. Man had developed in such a way that he had learned to love the earth. Yet there were also men who had been the companions of the gods during the Atlantean epoch, and it is justified to ask where they, the egos of the great initiates of that time, were. From the aspect of an Atlantean ego, who dwelled in a softer and finer body, earthly existence was such that these egos only had to incarnate to fill the needs of maintaining a connection between the world's primeval wisdom and humanity. The great Buddha is one of these individualities. He was really able to fill the Oriental writings with that deep wisdom and great spiritual force that we find in them. As occultists, we are able to understand the communications related to him, and we may even take them literally. When we read, for example, that at his birth he shone like the bright light of the sun, or when Buddha says, "I have entered my last incarnation. Henceforth I do not need to come down to the earth again, unless I do it of my own free will," such statements are literally true. During the post-Atlantean epoch, he also worked his way through intellectual knowledge, and we can understand him when he says that the line of incarnations and the different stages of initiations through which he had passed flashed up before him. Before me stood the splendour of the forms, but my intuition was as yet not pure. I saw the spirits of knowledge, but my intuition was as yet not pure. I saw the place of initiation, but my intuition was as yet not pure. I was a companion among them. Now my intuition was pure. This is Buddha's illumination. He is one of those with whom we live in Rosicrucian theosophy. We have already named three of the masters, Serapis, Scipianus, and Buddha, and we thus see how these leading personalities stand within the present time. An occultist contests these findings. In the realm of spiritual economy, we not only find what these exalted men left behind, everything of value to humanity has also been preserved. Take an individual such as Galileo, who in the 16th century had achieved such significant results in physics. Galileo had an etheric body that was not lost when he died. Far away from the place where Galileo had worked, a man lived in the middle of the 18th century who, after many years of a devotional childhood, prepared himself for an important task. Deep in the heart of Russia, on the shores of the Baltic Sea, lived a man in the plainest circumstances. His name was Michael Lomonosov. Unknown without means, he wandered to Moscow, where he studied. In 1711 he founded the Russian grammar. Lomonosov bore within him the etheric body of Galileo. A person who knew that the etheric body of Galileo had been preserved, who was present when this very fact was being occultly investigated, and who was the one who discovered this connection, knew nothing about Michael Lomonosov. This is no disgrace, since on the physical plane one cannot know everything. But here we see that through the law of spiritual economy, valuable elements are preserved and the past is connected with the future. In the Rosicrucian mysteries, for example, we can also come across the individual who on the physical plane was incarnated as Buddha. During the Atlantean age, he had only lived in an etheric body as a bodhisattva, but later on he came down into a physical body as Buddha. Let us now turn to the times of Buddha and Zarathustra, and to what souls had to do in the intermediate epochs. On the one hand, we have the teachings of Ahura Mazda, on the other the side of man that gradually came to cherish the earth. Envision again the Indian, Persian, and Chaldean, Assyrian, Babylonian times, during which the soul gradually lost its connection with the spiritual world. Then, in ancient Greece, the soul came to love the earth so deeply that the statement, "Better to be a beggar in the upper world than a king in the realm of shades," was accepted as a truth. During the fourth post-Atlantean epoch, the Greco-Roman, everything in the external world appeared beautiful and delightful. The CMA, for example, observed the temple of Paston with his physical eye. He may delight in the beauties of its forms, the harmony of its lines. When, however, he turns his gaze away from the temple to seek for it in the spiritual world, nothing of it is there. Everything seems to be blotted out. This is the experience these souls had between death and a new birth. They were isolally segregated within their own individualities, so that they longed to be back in the physical world with all its beauty. Ahura Mazda had to shed his light into this icy separateness. The leader of the sun himself had to descend to the earth. He had to become a human being in the physical world in order to help both the living and the dead. He had to be a man among men. The high and beautiful that lives in the sun descended to the earth and revealed itself in man. Previously it manifested itself in the elements. It revealed itself to Moses in the burning bush and in the fire of Sinai. The Israelites were to make no graven image of their God. Why? Because no external name can designate me, the divine being. Only an entirely different name, the I am, can express itself. The only possibility of discovering the name of the spirit of the Son is to seek it in man himself. The ego that lives in man is the Christ being. The Jehovah revelation precedes the Christ. This was at the time when the Christ being could gradually descend to the earth. What had Zarathustra once promised the high sun being? What was it that he sacrificed to him? His body, senses, life and speech. Zarathustra was born again as a contemporary of the great Buddha. He could then build up himself the etheric and astral bodies that he had sacrificed. He was reborn as Zarathus, or Nazarathus, and he became the teacher of Pythagoras. Pythagoras was reborn as one of the 3 wise men of the East, and he became one of the disciples of Jesus of Nazareth. Zarathustra, who had once sacrificed his etheric and astral bodies, was also able to give up his external sheath of him, whose coming he had announced. As the Jesus of Nazareth of Western occultism, he could place his physical body at the disposal of the Sun Spirit, and he could say, "I am the light of the world." The Christ being was known in all the mysteries. In ancient India, at the time of the 7 rishis, the being who represented Christ was called Vishnu Karman. Zarathustra named him Ahura Mazda. In Egypt he was known as Osiris. The Jewish people called him Yahweh or Jehovah. During the 4th epoch of culture, this same being lived for 3 years upon our physical earth. He is the being who will in future reunite the sun with the earth. When the blood streamed from the wounds of the Redeemer upon Golgotha, Christ united himself mystically with the earth. Afterwards, the Christ himself appeared in the aura of the earth, and he is to be found there even now. Who was the first man who saw Christ in the aura of the earth? It was St. Paul, who did more than any other for the diffusion of Christianity. What changed Saul into Paul? Not the teachings nor the events that took place in Palestine, but the event at Damascus, which was a supersensible event. Before that experience he could not believe that the one who had died so ignominiously upon the cross could have been the Christ, but as an initiate of the Kabbalah he knew that when Christ appears on earth he will be visible in the aura of the earth. Such was the experience of Paul, which transformed him from a Saul to a Paul. Concerning himself, Paul said that this was a premature birth. The same is also said of Buddha. To be born prematurely means that such individuals do not descend too deeply into the physical substance. When Paul became clairvoyant before Damascus, he saw and recognized Christ. Christ was also active in Buddha when he was a bodhisattva. Since the event of Golgotha, Christ has become the planetary spirit of the earth. Since then, he is to be found in the physical aura of the earth. A new light has been kindled to this and the world beyond by the influence of the Christ principle. The body of Jesus of Nazareth, the etheric and astral bodies, and the ego of Christ of Nazareth exist in the spiritual world in many copies. This expresses something highly significant. In order to understand it, let us consider an example from nature. Think of a kernel of corn that grows to produce ears bearing many seeds. This apparently simple example from nature symbolizes events in the supersensible world that follow definite laws. Many copies of the etheric and astral bodies of Jesus of Nazareth exist to be incorporated in bearers of the Christ principle. Everything connected with the Christ principle is so significant that humanity can only gradually grasp it. St. Augustine, for example, bore within him a copy of the etheric body of Jesus of Nazareth. This will enable you to better understand his life, errors, and achievements. His ego and astral body were left to their own resources, while a great mystical capacity lived in his etheric body. St. Francis of Assisi and Thomas Aquinas had woven into their beings copies of the astral body of Jesus of Nazareth. It is this fact that enabled them to exercise such powerful influences as teachers. They worked out of a sphere in which Christ had once lived. In some cases, external events such as natural catastrophes act as aids in this process of incorporation. It is said of Thomas Aquinas that lightning struck and killed his little sister in her cradle in the room where he was standing, but spared him. This lightning bolt shows that the elemental forces were necessary to help him take in the copy of the astral body of Jesus of Nazareth. Elizabeth or Pharangina also had an imprint of the astral body of Jesus of Nazareth. Zarathustra, or Jesus of Nazareth, is one of the three masters of the Rosicrucians. Many copies of his ego, that is to say, of an ego in which the Christ spirit has taken up his abode, exist in the spiritual world. For the future development of humanity, the copies of the ego of Jesus of Nazareth are waiting for us in the spiritual world. People who can strive to the heights of spiritual wisdom and love are candidates for those copies of the ego of Jesus of Nazareth. They become bearers of Christ through Christophori. It is their task on earth to be the heralds of his second coming. It gives us strength for our future work to know what individualities stand behind the mission of significant men. These are facts that can be tested. Not everyone is able to investigate what takes place behind the curtains of the physical world, but everyone can examine the results of such investigations with the aid of the Holy Scriptures, written before and after Christ. These facts can enlighten human understanding and can then become spiritual lifeblood. From Buddha to Christ by Rudolf Steiner. This is Lecture 2, Buddha and Christ. Since its inception, the anthroposophical movement has often been confused with various other contemporary tendencies. It has been accused, in particular, of desiring to implant one or another of the Oriental spiritual influences, such as that of Buddhism, into Western culture. For this reason, what is to be said here today should be especially interesting to spiritual research, since certain observations concerning the significance of Buddhism and Christianity will be presented from the standpoint of spiritual science. Anyone who has acquainted himself in some degree with the nature of Buddhism will know how its founder, Gautama Buddha, evaded all questions concerning the evolution of the world and the foundations of human existence. He would not speak of these problems, but would only consider the means by which mankind could enter into a form of existence that was satisfying in itself. From the start, therefore, one cannot regard spiritual science, which never avoids these questions concerning the source and origin of existence, and the great facts of evolution, as being similar to Buddhism. It is the case, however, that a certain trend of thought that exists within the sphere of spiritual science is being increasingly identified with Buddhism. That the idea of reincarnation, the conception of repeated lives on earth for humanity, and also the conception of what is passed on from life to life as spiritual cause and effect, should be designated as Buddhism is really astonishing. The function of anthroposophy, or spiritual science, is not to acknowledge allegiance to any particular name, but only to what is possible to investigate as truth unconnected with any names whatsoever. The fact that the idea of reincarnation is also to be found in the teachings of Gautama Buddha, even though in an entirely different form, is analogous, where present-day spiritual science is concerned, to the fact that elementary geometry is also to be found in Euclid. Just as little as it is justifiable to accuse every teacher of geometry of perpetrating Euclidism, so is it equally unjustifiable to accuse spiritual science, when it makes the idea of reincarnation its own, of being Buddhistic simply because similar concepts was also taught by Buddha. Nevertheless, it is necessary to point out that spiritual science is the instrument that we must use in order to penetrate and test the source of every religion, be it Christianity, which is at the foundation of our European culture, or Buddhism. Let us now enter thoughtfully and deeply into the spirit of Buddhism in the sense of spiritual science, and compare it with the spirit of Christianity. It will be better not to turn immediately to the great doctrines which can so easily be interpreted in different ways, but rather to try to construct a picture of the immense significance and far-reaching results of Buddhism from various symptomatic facts concerning its whole character and meaning. This can best be done by considering a Buddhist scripture that is held in high esteem, the questions that were put by King Milinda to the sage Nagasena. In this exchange between King Milinda and Nagasena, we are given the very spirit of the trend of Buddhistic thinking. The powerful, spiritually minded King Milinda questions Nagasena, the sage. The king, who has never been at a loss in the presence of a sage, because he has always known how to evade anything that was said in opposition to his own ideas, goes to Nagasena to speak with him about the meaning of the eternal, the immortal part of human nature that passes onward from incarnation to incarnation. "How did you come here, on foot or in a carriage?" Nagasena asks the king. "In a carriage," the king replies. "Well," said Nagasena, "let us now consider what a carriage is. Are the shafts the carriage? No. Is the seat you sat upon the carriage? No. Are the wheels the carriage? No. Is the yoke the carriage? No. One can enumerate all the parts of the carriage, but they in themselves are not the carriage, yet together they are the carriage. It consists of all the parts put together. Thus carriage is no more than a name for the whole made by the parts. If we consider it apart from its separate entities, it is nothing but a name." The sense and the object of what Nagasena said is that one must turn one's gaze away from everything that the eye can behold in the physical world. Nagasena wanted to point out that actually nothing exists in the physical world that in itself constitutes what is collectively designated by a name. He thus reveals the worthlessness and meaninglessness of all the physical and material constituents of things. To make his example clear, Nagasena says, "It is thus also with all that constitutes man, and that passes onward from one earth life to another. Is it in the hands, legs, and head that go from life to life? No. Is it what you do today or tomorrow? No. What is it then that collectively is man? It is name and form, just as it is with the carriage. When we gather the different parts together, we have only a name. There is nothing particular but the parts." So that we may see this even clearer, there is another analogy that Nagasena demonstrated to King Milinda. The king said, "You say, O wise Nagasena, that of what stands before me as man, name and form passes from life to life. Is it then the name and form of the same being that appear again in a new embodiment on earth?" "See now," replied Nagasena, "how the mango tree bears a fruit. A thief comes and steals the fruit. The owner of the tree says, 'You have robbed me of my fruit.' But the thief answers, 'It is not your fruit. Your fruit was the one you planted in the ground. It has transformed itself, and the one growing on the tree simply bears the same name. It is not your fruit.'" Then Nagasena continued, "It is true that it bears the same name and form, but it is not the same fruit. Still, one can punish the thief in spite of that. So it is the same with what reappears in a later life on earth in relation to what was there in earlier lives. It is like the fruit of the mango tree that was planted in the earth, but only because the owner had first planted the fruit in the earth was it possible for a fruit to grow upon a tree. Therefore, we must say that the fruit belongs to him who buried the first fruit in the earth. Thus it is with man. His deeds and his destiny are the fruit and the effects of his earlier lives. What appears is new, however, just as the fruit of the mango tree is new. So Nagasena showed how what is once there in any one earth life strives to reappear, transformed, as effects in later life. It is easier to become sensitive towards the whole spirit of Buddhistic teaching by such examples as this, than by a study of the main principles, which can be interpreted in various ways. If we let the spirit of these analogies work upon us, we see clearly enough that the Buddhist desires to wean his adherents from the idea of what may be regarded as the separate individuality, the definite personality. He wants to point out that what reappears in a new embodiment is, it is true, the result of this personality, but that one cannot speak of an interrupted ego in the true sense of the word, as extending from one incarnation to another. Now, even though such a comparison may never have been made before, when we turn from Buddhism to Christianity, we can use these analogies of Nagasena in the Christian sense, and present them somewhat as follows. Suppose we imagine that King Milinda and Nagasena were reborn, and the conversation between them took place today. Were it fully dominated by the spirit of Christianity, Nagasena would say, "Behold the hand. Is this hand a man? No, the hand is not the man, for if there were only a hand, there would be no man. If you cut the hand off a man's body, however, it dries up, and in 3 weeks or so there would be no hand left. How, then, is a hand a hand? By reason of a man. Is the head a man? No. Is the heart anything but itself? No. Because if we remove the heart from a man, in a short time it ceases to be a heart, and the man ceases to be a man. Therefore the heart is a heart by reason of the man. The man is a man by reason of his heart. Moreover, man is only man upon the earth because he possesses a heart as an instrument. So the living organism has parts, which in themselves are nothing but become something by reason of their coexistence within the body. When we consider what the separate parts are not, we find we have to fall back upon something that is invisible behind them, ruling them and holding them together, to use them as its instruments. Even when we behold all the separate parts together, we still have not found the man himself, if we only look for him as the sum of the separate parts. Then Nagasena could look back upon the old analogy of the carriage, and speaking, of course, out of the spirit of Christianity, could say, "It is true that the shafts are not the carriage, for the shafts alone could not carry you. It is also true that the wheels are not the carriage, for they could not carry you, nor could the yoke or seat. Though it is true that the carriage is only a name for the assembled parts, yet you are not conveyed by the parts, but by something that is not the parts, for by their means alone you cannot travel. But by the name something particular is denoted, and thus we are led to an entity that is non-existent in any of its parts." In this way the Buddhistic spirit strives away from what is perceived in order to surmount it, and to deny the possibility that any particular thing is seen. The spirit that imbues the Christian way of thinking, and this is what concerns us, perceives the separate parts of an object, a carriage for example, in such a way that there is a tendency to turn from the parts to a recognition of the whole. Because of this difference between the Buddhistic and the Christian conception of things, remarkable consequences arise from each. The following conclusion, which we are led to naturally from the foregoing indications, arises from the Buddhistic approach. A man stands before us. He is constructed of several parts. This man busies himself in the world and performs various actions. While he appears thus before us, his Buddhistic thinking causes him to feel the worthlessness and unreality of everything around him. He is led, however, to free himself from his attachment to nothingness so that he may rise to a higher existence in reality. He turns away from all that his eyes behold, and from everything he can gain by means of human knowledge. In other words, he turns away from his world of sense perceptions, because everything that it offers, when conceived only as name and form, reveals itself in all its emptiness. There is no truth in anything belonging to the physical world. Now, where does the Christian conception lead us? Here the individual parts are not seen as separate, but regarded in such a way that one indivisible unity in reality is perceived governing them. The hand is seen to be only a hand because a man, using it as a hand, makes it a hand. Therefore there is something here, a man, that immediately inevitably suggests what stands behind it. Something quite different from the Buddhistic approach arises from this way of thinking, so that we can say, here stands a man. What he is, by reason of his different parts, and by means of his action, can only be because behind it all there stands a spiritual being, as man, who not only brings the parts into movement, but also performs the individual acts. What is revealed in the separate parts and lives itself out in them has poured itself into all that is visible of the man. It is this, within what is seen, that will reap the fruits of actions and be able to draw from the world of the senses something that we may call an event, which will be carried onward into a later incarnation on earth. There, behind the external appearance, stands the doer, who does not spurn the outer world, but so handles it that its fruits are taken up and carried into a future life. When we as students of spiritual science consider reincarnation from the Buddhistic point of view, we must express it by saying that that of which man is the unified expression in his earthly life has no value. His deeds alone have their effects in the following incarnation. In the light of Christianity, however, what makes man a unity in his earthly life is the fullness of his ego, that has value, and it carries the fruits of one incarnation onward into the next. We can see that a quite definite configuration of thinking, which is far more important than theories and principles, cleaves asunder these two great world conceptions. If we were less prone in these days to depend so much on theories, we would find that we could arrive far more easily at an understanding of the main characteristics of various spiritual tendencies by turning our attention especially to their symptoms and methods of presentation. That holds good both for the Buddhistic and the Christian conceptions. In the conversation just related, we have the very core of the Buddhistic conception as expressed by the founder of Buddhism himself. The theme of what is said here, however, is certainly not intended to develop opposition to the founder of the Buddhistic world conception, but rather to portray it quite objectively and in accordance with its true characteristics. The legend of the Buddha describes clearly enough, even though in pictorial fashion, what the founder of Buddhism intended. We are told that Gautama Buddha was born the son of King Suddhodana, and that he was brought up in a royal palace where he was surrounded by everything that could serve to ennoble human life. During his earthly years he was not allowed to know anything of human sorrow and pain, but lived in the midst of happiness and joyful destructions of all kinds. Then we are told how one day, when he was 29 years old, he left the palace and for the first time in his life was confronted by sorrow and pain and all the dark shadows of existence. It is told how he met an old man whose life was ebbing away, and again how he saw a corpse. It dawned upon him that life must be utterly different from all that he had experienced in the palace, where he had known nothing but joy, where disease and death were unknown to him, and where he had learned to believe that life could never weaken or cease. Now he discovered that life embraced both pain and sorrow. Heavily indeed did this discovery weigh upon the great soul of Buddha. Life contained pain, sorrow, and death. He had seen it for himself in the sick man, the aged, and the corpse. What is the value of life, he asked himself, if it bears sickness, old age, and death in it? From that question there arose at last the monumental teaching of Buddha on the sorrow of life. This he gathered together in the words, birth is sorrow, old age is sorrow, sickness is sorrow, death is sorrow. All existence is filled with sorrow. Later he further elaborated this theme with the words, that we cannot always be reunited with those we love is sorrow, that we must be joined to what we do not love is sorrow. That we cannot obtain what we desire in every circumstance of life is sorrow. Sorrow is everywhere, no matter where we turn our gaze. If Buddha's use of the word sorrow has not quite the meaning that it is imparted to it today, Still, it is intended to express that man is everywhere and at all times a prey to everything he comes up against, assaulting him from without, and he is unable to unfold active forces to meet these things. Life is sorrow, said Buddha, therefore we must seek its causes. There then arose before his soul the picture of what he called the thirst for existence. Since we look out upon the world and see that sorrow is everywhere, we are compelled to say that man is bound to experience sorrow if he enters this world, but we must also ask what the cause of his suffering is. He suffers because he desires, first, to be incarnated in this world. The passionate longing to forsake the spiritual world to enter a physical body so that he can become aware of the outer material world is the cause of this sorrow-filled human existence. The only way to escape from sorrow is by conquering the thirst for life, which can actually be overcome when, according to the teaching of Buddha, men learn to unfold within themselves the so-called Eightfold Path. This consists, so it is generally said, of right judgment, right discrimination, right speech, right deed, right living, right aspiration, right thinking, and right contemplation. Through the right attitude towards life, according to the great Buddha, something gradually arises within men's souls that destroys the passionate longing for existence. This brings them so far that at last they are no longer compelled to descend into physical incarnation, and they are liberated from a further existence overwhelmed by sorrow. These things, according to Buddha, constitute the Four Noble Truths, namely the knowledge of sorrow, the knowledge of the causes of sorrow, the knowledge of the necessity for liberation from sorrow, and the knowledge of the means of liberation from sorrow. These are the four holy truths that Buddha gave in the great sermon at Benares after his enlightenment under the Bodhi tree about the 5th or 6th century before Christ. Liberation from the pain of existence stands in the forefront of Buddhism. It makes it possible to describe the religion of Buddha as a religion of redemption from suffering in the highest sense of the word, and since all existence is bound up with suffering, it is a redemption above all from continued rebirth. This is entirely in accord with the presentation of Buddhism that is embodied in the Nagasena conversations. In the moment that human thinking, which embraces the outer world of the senses, beholds its worthlessness, when what is a mere gathering together of parts possesses for the thinker only name and form, when nothing passes from incarnation to incarnation save the results of existence, then it must be said that supposedly true existence is only attained when man is able to overcome and transcend everything that is to be found in the external world of the senses. Now it is not correct, and this can be perceived even by the simplest method of observation, to say that Christianity is a religion of redemption in the same sense as Buddhism. If we place Christianity in its correct relation to Buddhism, we can speak of it as a religion of rebirth. Christianity proceeds from the knowledge that everything that, taken together, represents a man in a single life is fruitful. These fruits have importance and value for his innermost being and are carried over by him into a new life when they are brought to a higher state of perfection. Everything that we experience and absorb in a single life always appears again and grows ever more towards perfection until it is revealed at last in its true spiritual form. When the apparently worthless in our existence is taken hold of by the spiritual, it is resurrected in a degree more perfect than before and is spiritually embodied. Nothing in existence is really worthless because it rises again if the spirit has entered into it aright. The thought content of Christianity is a religion of rebirth, a religion of the resurrection of the best that we have experienced. It is a religion in which no single thing on earth is a nothingness. Rather, everything is a building stone for the great edifice being erected from the gathering of the spiritual from the world of the senses. Buddhism is a religion of liberation from existence. Christianity is the opposite, a religion of rebirth on a more spiritual level. This is revealed in the least as well as in the greatest of the forms of its presentation, no less than in its fundamental principles. We can say that the actual reasons for this difference between the two religions arise from the antithetical character of Oriental and Western culture. There's a radical difference between the method of presenting things that spring from the culture that gave birth to Buddhism and the method that springs from the culture into which Christianity poured itself. It is possible to describe this difference quite simply. It lies in the fact that all true Oriental culture that has not been fertilized by the West is non-historical, whereas Western culture is historical. This is the ultimate root of the difference between the Christian and Buddhistic conceptions. The Christian conception recognizes that not only are there repeated lives on earth, but history rules in them. That is to say, that what to begin with can be experienced at a higher and more perfect stage can continue to perfect itself throughout the course of succeeding incarnations. Where Buddhism sees the liberation from earthly existence in the ascent to nirvana, Christianity sees as the goal of its evolution that everything engendered and achieved in each earthly life ascends to ever higher degrees of perfection until, spiritualized and transfigured, it consummates its resurrection at the end of the world. Buddhism is non-historical precisely in accordance with the character of its cultural origin. It is non-historical for the simple reason that it merely places the external world in opposition to mankind, which acts within it. The Buddhist says that we look back at past incarnations or forward to future ones, but we stand opposed to the outer world. He does not ask if it is possible that man in earlier days was differently placed in relation to the world, or may be perhaps differently placed in the future. Christianity does ask that question. But the Buddhist arrives at the conception that the relationship of man to the world in which he is incarnated is an unchanging one, that, driven as he is by the thirst for existence into a physical embodiment, he enters a world of sorrow, no matter whether he had been compelled to an embodiment in the past, or whether he is so compelled in the present. It is always sorrow that the world brings him. So the incarnations succeed each other, and there is no idea of bringing evolution to its true aspect as a historical conception. The conception is clear that fundamentally the Buddhist finds his nirvana, his state of bliss, solely in relinquishing repeated lives on earth. He also sees that the source of misery is the external world. He says that it is inevitable, if you abandon yourself to the physical world, that suffering must be your lot, since suffering arises from it. That is not Christian. The Christian conception is through and through sequential and historical. It is not concerned with the non-historical relationship of opposition to the physical world, but states that as man passes from incarnation to incarnation, he is indeed placed in opposition to a physical world. If this world brings him sorrow, or offers what does not satisfy or fill him with an inwardly harmonious life, it does not arise from the fact that earthly existence as a whole is such that suffering is inevitable. It comes because man has brought with him a false relation to the external world, and does not place himself rightly within it. The Old Testament and the Christianity of the New Testament point to a definite occurrence whereby man evolves something within himself that causes him, through his inner life, to make the world his source of sorrow. Hence it is not the external world in which we are made flesh, not what enters our eyes and echoes in our ears, that brings us sorrow. It is what man once unfolded within himself that was placed in a wrong relation to this external world. This was an inheritance that passed from age to age, so that mankind today still suffers pain. Christianity indicates that this state of things arose when humanity was at the beginning of its earthly existence. We can enlarge upon these two aspects of the foundations of these religions. Buddhism forever emphasizes the world to be Maya, illusion. Christianity asserts that, to begin with, it is true that what man beholds of the world is illusion, but that it arises from man himself because he has so formed his organs of perception that his vision cannot penetrate to the spiritual world. The outer world is not the illusion, but rather what man perceives. Buddhism says, look at what happens around you. It is illusion. Behold the flashing lightning. It is illusion. What roars as thunder is Maya, the great deception. Not so would the Christian spirit reply. Until now, human beings have been unable to open their spiritual eyes and ears. Were they open, they would reveal the outer world. No, it is not that we are surrounded by Maya, but that man cannot perceive the true form of the world because he is so imperfect. So Christianity seeks in prehistoric ages the event that made the human heart become incapable of creating the true conception of the physical world. There, through the development of many incarnations, we have, in the Christian sense, to regain the state of spiritual sight and hearing before the true form of the external world can be perceived. Repeated incarnations, therefore, are not meaningless, but they are the way towards the perception, in the light of the spirit, of finding the spiritual within the physical. It is this that the Buddhists would escape. To overcome this world, which appears to us now to be physical, with something that man does not yet possess, but that he can attain as a spiritual reality. To overcome human error, which sees the world as Maya, is the inner impulse of Christianity. So the teacher of Christianity is not one who says, the world is the wellspring of sorrow, escape from it to another that is utterly different, attain nirvana. Christianity sets the Christ before us as the mighty impulse for the forward evolution of the earth. It is he who pointed in the strongest possible way to the inner being of man. From this he could unfold the power to use all earthly incarnations to carry their fruits forward to his future incarnations through his own strength. He would not bring an end to his incarnations and enter nirvana, but would use all he could of them and work upon their results so that he could spiritually experience resurrection. Here we have the great distinction that makes Buddhism a non-historical and Christianity a historical conception. The Christian idea seeks the origin and source of man's pain and sorrow in the fall. In a resurrection he finds the healing of them. You will not be freed from pain and sorrow by departing from earthly existence, but you will be set free when you correct the error that gives you a false relation to the world. The source of sorrow is in yourself. If you perceive correctly, you will know that the outer world indeed and in truth melts away like mist in the sun, but all the deeds you have performed in the world, all your experiences, will be brought to a resurrection in the spirit. This is Christianity as a religion of rebirth, a religion of resurrection. Only thus can it be placed beside Buddhism. That is to say, that only in the sense of spiritual scientific thought can these two religions be compared and their deepest impulses understood. What has been indicated here can be verified in the minutest details. For instance, one can find in Buddhism something like the Sermon on the Mount. He who hears the law, that is, what Buddhism communicates as the law, is blessed. He who can live with all creatures and does no evil towards them is blessed. We can consider the Buddhistic beatitudes side by side with the Sermon on the Mount as it is given in the Gospel of Matthew, but we must understand them correctly. Let us take a moment and compare them with what we find in St. Matthew. First we hear the mighty word, "Blessed are those who are beggars for the spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Here we find not only "Blessed are those who hear the law," but another sentence is added. "Blessed are they who are poor in spirit, so that they must beg for the spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." What does this mean? Now we can only correctly understand such a sentence when we bring the whole of the historically conceived teaching of Christianity before our mind's eye. Then we recognize that all human soul capacities have a history and have an evolution in the sense that what is present today was not always present. It tells us that what we possess today as our reason, as scientific thought, did not exist in primeval times. Instead, there was present in humanity what might be called a dark, dim clairvoyance. Men did not come to their knowledge of external things in the way they do today, but something arose within them like an archetypal wisdom, far surpassing what we can achieve through reason. Whoever knows history knows that such a primeval wisdom existed. Though men did not know how to construct machines and railways, nor to rule the surrounding world by means of natural forces, yet they had a knowledge of the divine spiritual foundations of the world that infinitely transcended our own. It would be quite wrong, however, to suppose that their knowledge was gained by thinking. On the contrary, it rose up in their souls as though bestowed upon them as revelation, as dim inspirations rising within them without their cooperation. They were there as real images of the spiritual world. It was a really present archetypal wisdom. Human progress, however, was such that this shadowy clairvoyance, this wisdom, had to decrease from incarnation to incarnation. It was necessary that it should be lost in order that man might learn to grasp the things of the world by his reason. In the future, man will be able to see clairvoyantly into the spiritual world again, and will also possess the forms of this present knowledge. Today we are in an immediate state. The old clairvoyance is lost, and what we now possess has been developed through long ages. How has mankind arrived at a knowledge of the world through his reason and inner self-consciousness? More especially, when did self-consciousness appear? As a rule, the evolution of humanity is not observed with such exactitude as this, but it was at the time in which Christ Jesus came to the earth. Humanity then stood at a turning point in evolution. The old clairvoyance had gone, and the time that has brought about our greatest achievements was beginning. The entrance of Christ into world evolution was the turning point from the old age to the new, from the old world conception to the new. There is a technical expression from the state of achievement that it was then possible for man to experience when he had begun to know the outer world through his self-consciousness. It is used by John the Baptist when he proclaimed the kingdom of heaven to be at hand, which means that the knowledge of the world in ideas and concepts is at hand. In other words, man is no longer directed to the old clairvoyance, but he must learn to know and investigate the world out of his own being. The tremendous impulse for what man had to gain by means of his own ego, and not through the grace of bestowal, was given by Christ Jesus. So there are great depths of meaning hidden even in the first words of the Sermon on the Mount. They might well be expressed by saying that humanity stands today at the stage at which it is a beggar for the spirit. Previously, men possessed clairvoyance, vision, and could behold the spiritual world. That ability is now lost, but a time is coming when, through the power of the ego and the inner revelation of the Word, men will find a substitute for the old clairvoyance. Therefore, not only those who in ancient times attained to the Spirit through dim inspirations are blessed, but also those who have no clairvoyance, because we have lost it to the necessary course of evolution. They are not unblessed who are beggars for the Spirit, because they are poor in spirit. Blessed are they, for theirs is what is revealed to them by their egos and their attainments through their self-consciousness. Further, blessed are they that mourn, for even though the outer world causes suffering because of man's wrong attitude towards it, yet the time has now come when man, if he takes hold of his self-consciousness and unfolds the forces inherent in his ego, will know the remedy for his pain. He will find within himself the possibility of comfort. The time has come when the external means of comfort have lost their individual significance. The ego has now to find the healing balm within. Blessed are they who can no longer find in the external world what was once to be found there. The fourth beatitude, blessed are they that hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they shall be filled, is also to be understood in this sense. The source of the righteousness that shall counterbalance the unrighteousness of the world is now to be found in the ego. Thus Christ appears as the guide of the human self. He points directly to the divine in man, and gives the indication to take into his inner self what lives in him. Then he shall find the force necessary to carry the fruits of earthly existence from incarnation to incarnation. An event which at first appears as a wholly painful one in Christian doctrine, namely the death of Christ Jesus and the mystery of Golgotha, also belongs here. This death lacks the usual significance of death. Christ reveals the truth that this death is to be the starting point for an immortal and unconquerable life. It is not merely an event to release him from life, but it is passed through because it leads to an ascending process, and eternal and infinite living flows from it. This is something that was accepted by those who lived in the first centuries after Christ, and that will gradually become recognized more fully as the understanding of the Christ impulse grows greater. When that time in the future is reached, men will understand that 600 years before the Christian era, one of the greatest of human beings, finding a corpse and death upon leaving his palace, could only conceive of it as death is sorrow, liberation from death is redemption, and could have nothing to do with death's dominion. 600 years passed, and we reached the time of Christ. When yet another 600 years had passed, a symbol was raised that only the man of the future will understand. What was this symbol? It is not a Buddha nor another chosen one. No, simple men passing by saw the symbol of the cross, and upon it they saw a dead body. They did not say, "Death is sorrow." They did not turn away from it, but they saw in this dead body what became for them a bulwark of the eternal in life. They saw what conquers death and points to the transcendence of earthly things. The noble Buddha saw a corpse, and he turned from the material world with the judgment that all death is sorrow. Those simple men who beheld the cross and its dead burden did not turn away, but gazed upon it because they found in it a witness of the everlasting life that streams from earthly death. So, 600 years before the Christian era, Buddha stood before a corpse. And 600 years after the death of Christ, the simple man of the world beheld the symbol that expressed what had happened with the founding of Christianity. Never in the history of human evolution had such a transformation as this taken place. The more objectively these things are grasped, the more clearly will the great significance of Buddhism emerge. We have shown how mankind once possessed a primeval wisdom, and how in the course of many incarnations this wisdom gradually declined. The appearance of Christ marked the close of the old development. It was a mighty historical indication in the world that the ancient archetypal wisdom was lost. In the historical sense, this explains the turning away from life. Christ marks the beginning, however, of a new development that sees life as the source of the eternal. There has been no previous explanation of these immensely important facts of human evolution, because these things are not yet understood. It sometimes happens that there can be in our time beautiful and noble natures who seek satisfaction in Buddhism because they cannot find in external concepts what truly fills their rich inner lives. In a certain sense, Buddhism reveals to them how the human being can transcend his own nature when, by developing his own inner forces, he raises himself above the world of the senses. This is only possible, however, because the greatest impulse, the very essence of Christianity, is still so little understood. Spiritual science must some day become the means by which the core of the whole presentation of the Christ impulse can be more deeply penetrated. It is just the idea of evolution, which spiritual science approaches so honestly, that will lead humanity to an exact and intimate grasp of Christianity. So spiritual science may rest in the hope that a Christian teaching, rightly understood, will gradually be unfolded rather than an incorrect form. Nor should Buddhism be transplanted into our modern times. It would in fact be a short-sighted policy that would want to establish Buddhism in the West. Anyone who knows the conditions of Western spiritual life knows that even the tendencies that are apparently ranged against Christianity have borrowed their whole arsenal of weapons from it. A Darwin or a Haeckel would never have been possible, strange as though this may sound, if it had not been for the educational systems of Christendom. These systems alone have made it possible for them to think their thoughts. That is to say, those particular forms of thought were already there and nourished in the Christian world, and they were able to use them as weapons of offence against their own mother, so to speak. What they and others have to say is often, because of the way it is said, apparently directed against Christianity. The thoughts, however, could never have been there without a Christian education. For this reason, to graft any Oriental system upon our own culture would be of no avail, because it would oppose every condition of the spiritual life of the West. To avoid this, it is only necessary to think clearly about the fundamental teachings of the two religions. If the spiritual life of today is closely observed, it will certainly be seen that because of the lack of clarity that exists about these things, there are souls who, feeling sympathy with Buddhism and standing on the highest of philosophical watchtowers, would like to teach the renunciation of existence. Such a one was Schopenhauer. The whole tenor of his life might be described as Buddhistic. When he says, for instance, "The image of the highest type of man stands before us in one whom we call a saint, one who has overcome everything in life that the outer world can give, who stands there merely as a physical body, who conceals nothing of the ideal of the world environment within him, who desires naught, who merely waits until his body is destroyed, so that every trace of all that connected him with the physical world may be wiped out, so that, renouncing what is of the earth, he annihilates earth existence, so that at last nothing remains that in life leads from desire to pain, from fear to terror, from enjoyment to grief." Here Buddhism is introduced into our Western world. Such a thing happens because of our misapprehensions, because we do not understand clearly enough what the deepest impulses of Christianity are and what its content and form denote. What have we achieved through Christianity? If we regard the impulse alone, what we have achieved shows the depth of cleavage that can exist between Schopenhauer and one of the most significant personalities of our time, Goethe. While Schopenhauer sees his ideal in someone who has overcome all enjoyment and pain proceeding from outer life, one who merely exists waiting for the last threads to be severed that bind his physical body together, we find the very opposite in Goethe's picture of the struggle in Faust. He strides from desire to enjoyment, from enjoyment to desire, and at length purges himself and transforms his passions. What was to him the highest and holiest that can irradiate human life became itself a passion. Such was Faust, who did not say, "I wait until the last traces of my earthly life are obliterated." He proclaims the stupendous words, "The relics of my earthly sojourn are indestructible throughout the cons of time." That was how Goethe, in his Faust, expressed the meaning of spirit of what he, in his old age, once described to his secretary Eckermann. At least you admit that the conclusion of Faust, in which the redeemed soul ascends, was hard to portray. In dealing with a subject so far above the earthly and thus transcending conception, I might easily have succumbed to mere vagueness if I had not confined my poetical intentions within the sharp outlines of Christian and ecclesiastical figure and imagery, and so given them a healthy form and solidity. So Faust is made to ascend a rung of the ladder of existence, the step from the mortal to the immortal, from death to life, that had its origin in Christian symbolism. In Schopenhauer we see the unmistakable introduction of the Buddhistic element into Western thought. I wait until I have attained such perfection that with the death of my body the last traces of my earthly existence are obliterated. He also believed that this world conception would enable him to interpret the pictorial creations of Raphael and Correggio. Goethe, however, portrayed the individual as one striving upward, who knows that the sum total of earthly achievements is permanent and interwoven with eternity. The relics of my earthly sojourn are indestructible throughout the eons of time. That indeed is the true realistic Christian impulse, for it leads to a reawakening of earthly deeds as spiritual accomplishment. It is the reawakening of the best that can be achieved on earth. It is the religion of resurrection. It is the very truth of a realistic world conception that brings down the loftiest content for existence from spiritual heights into the world of the senses. We can say that something like the light of dawn shines out in Goethe. It is a self-comprehending Christianity of the future which, while acknowledging all the greatness and significance of Buddhism, yet negates its renunciation of earthly embodiments, pointing upward instead to a great acceptance of every single incarnation in the whole great sequence. So Goethe, in the sense of the true Christian of modern times, looks out over a past world from the womb of which all have been born, and upon a present world in which, if its true results are grasped, man achieves something that time cannot annihilate. In linking him in true theosophical fashion with the universe, Goethe cannot do otherwise than forge the links on the other side that bind man to the true content of Christianity. He says, therefore, "On the day when you to the world were given, the sun stood still, greeting every star, and never since then have you striven to grow by the laws that rule who you are. So must you be, and escape you cannot know, as the Sibyls and prophets told us long ago." By expressing man's connection with the outer world in this way, Goethe is inevitably pointing to the fact that as a man is born from the constellations of existence, he becomes in the world what is not only indestructible, but what must ultimately consummate his resurrection in a form that is spiritual. So he had to add these words. "And in all of time no power could undo the living form your life created of you." We can also add that there is neither a power nor time that can annihilate what is achieved in time itself, and that ripens as fruit for eternity. From Buddha to Christ by Rudolf Steiner. This is Lecture 3, Buddhism and Christianity. It is of special interest in the study of human evolution that Buddhism and the teaching of Buddha should be discussed frequently today, because it is only recently that an understanding of the essential nature of Buddhism, the longing for such an understanding, has made itself felt in our Western spiritual life. Think for a moment of Goethe, who so powerfully influenced Western culture at the end of the 18th century. When we examine his life and writings, we find no trace of the influence of Buddhism, but soon after there are distinct traces of Buddhist influence in Schopenhauer, who was, in a certain sense, a disciple of Goethe. Since his time, interest in the spiritual life of the East has steadily increased, and many people today feel an inherent desire to understand what really entered human evolution through all that is connected with the name of the great Buddha. Most people connect Buddhism, among other things, with the idea of reincarnation. Regarding its essentials, however, this cannot be done, at least in the form in which this truth is now often conceived. To those who have deeper insight, to link Buddhism with the teachings of repeated earthly lives is almost the same as saying that the deepest understanding of ancient works of art is to be found among those peoples who set about destroying them at the beginning of the Middle Ages. Grotesque as this may sound, it is nevertheless true. Its truth is brought home to us when we realize that the whole mood of Buddhism undervalues earthly lives. Indeed, its aim is rather to reduce their number. Liberation from rebirth is the innermost kernel of Buddhist thought, and its essence, freedom from repeated earthly lives, reincarnation being, of course, an already recognized truth. Even a superficial study of the history of Western spiritual life should tell us that the idea of reincarnation is not really essential to an understanding of Buddhism, nor is Buddhism essential to an understanding of reincarnation. Within our Western culture, Lessing had a magnificent conception of the idea of reincarnation, but was quite uninfluenced by Buddhistic thought. His most mature work, The Education of the Human Race, concludes with a confession of belief in repeated earthly lives. Is not all eternity mine, he asks, feeling that man's sojourn on earth may become fruitful if earthly lives are repeated. We are not on this earth for nothing. We are active in earthly life, and we may look forward to an even fuller life wherein the fruits of past lives may ripen. The prospect of a rich and greater future, the consciousness of continuous activity, are the essentials of Lessing's thought. Contrariwise, the essence of Buddhism is that it urges man to strive for the knowledge and wisdom that will free him from all desire for rebirth. Only when he can liberate himself from this necessity in one earthly life will he then enter the state that may be called eternity. I have endeavoured to show you that spiritual science has taken the idea of reincarnation neither from ancient tradition nor from Buddhism. The idea of reincarnation, in the sense of spiritual science, arises of necessity from an unprejudiced observation of life. It would therefore seem superficial to connect Buddhism directly with the idea of repeated earthly lives. To understand the essence of Buddhism, we must look in quite another direction. Here I must again remind you of the law of human evolution that we considered in connection with the great Zarathustra. In the course of time, the whole constitution of man's soul has passed through different stages and conditions. The events that external history and documents report are really a comparatively late phase in the evolution of mankind. When, with the help of spiritual science, we go back to prehistoric ages, we find that the nature of the soul and of man's consciousness in those early times was different, indeed, from what it is today. Let me briefly recapitulate. In normal human life today, we examine objects with our senses and form chains of thought with our practical wisdom and science, in effect, with our essentially intellectual consciousness. This has developed from quite a different kind of consciousness. In the chaotic melody of the dream, we have a last remnant, an atavistic heritage of clairvoyant faculties that were normal in the soul of prehistoric man. In those early times, the nature of the soul was such that in a condition between waking and sleeping, man gazed into the world that lies hidden behind that of the senses. Our consciousness today alternates between the waking and sleeping states, and we think of intelligence in connection with the waking life only. In more ancient times, however, pictures continually arose and passed away before the soul of man. These pictures were not as void of meaning as our dreams are today, but were related to supersensible events. Out of the condition of consciousness arising from those flying pictures, our present so-called intellectual consciousness gradually evolved. A kind of primeval clairvoyance preceded the gradual development of our modern consciousness. Prehistoric man, gazing into the supersensible worlds of this dreamlike clairvoyance, not only acquired knowledge, but experienced a deep inner satisfaction and bliss as he felt the connection of his soul with the spiritual world. In his intellectual consciousness today, man knows with certainty that his blood is composed of substances that also exist externally in physical space. Indeed, that his whole organism is built up materially. With equal certainty, prehistoric man knew that, so far as his soul and spirit were concerned, he had come forth from the spiritual world into which he gazed with his clairvoyant consciousness. I have said before that certain phenomena in human history, of which external facts also speak, can only be understood if the spiritual origin of man's earthly life is admitted. Even science is less inclined to agree with the assumption of materialistic anthropology that in prehistoric ages the general condition of humanity was such as we find still existing among the most primitive peoples today. It is gradually becoming evident that sublime conceptions of a spiritual world were current among ancient peoples, but were clothed in pictorial forms. Myths and legends are only intelligible when we trace them back to a primal wisdom that was altogether different in its nature from the intellectual science of today. True, there is not much sympathy as yet with the view that primitive peoples today are not typical of the original spirituality of man, but represent the decadence of an earlier time. Neither is it generally admitted that originally all peoples possessed a lofty wisdom derived from clairvoyant powers. Facts, however, will in time compel thinking people to admit, at least hypothetically, some of the truths investigated by spiritual science and fully corroborated by natural science. What spiritual science has to say about the future evolution of man will also be verified one day. Thus we must look back not only to a kind of primeval wisdom, but also to primeval feelings and perceptions in man, whose clairvoyant powers gave him knowledge of his connection with the spiritual world. Now it is easy to understand the possibility of two streams arising in the gradual transition from this ancient clairvoyance of the human soul to our modern intellectual mode of observing the material world. The one stream can be traced among peoples in whom the memories and instincts were preserved, and who felt that man, through his clairvoyant perception, was once united with the spiritual world, but that he has since descended into the world of the senses. This feeling gradually extended into a general attitude of soul, until man could say that he had entered the phenomenal world, but that it was Maya, illusion. Only when he was linked with the spiritual world could he know his true being. So among those peoples who had preserved this dim remembrance of ancient clairvoyant powers, there arose a sense of loss and a certain indifference to their material environment and to all that can be apprehended by the intellect. Zarathustraism is typical of the second current, in which people could say that they must adapt themselves to the new world that now entered their consciousness for the first time. These men did not look back with regret to something that man had lost. On the contrary, they felt impelled to seek and acquire all the powers that would enable them to penetrate and understand the surrounding world of sense. The urge arose within them to unite themselves with the world, not to look back with regret, but to look forward as warriors, saying, "The same divine spiritual essence of which we were once a part is also poured into the world immediately surrounding us. It is in this surrounding world we must seek. It is our task to unite with the good spiritual elements, thus helping to forward the evolution of the world." This conception is typical of the stream of thought that had its rise in Asiatic regions lying north of the lands, where men looked back with sorrow to what man had once possessed. In India a spiritual life arose that was the natural fruit of this looking backward to men's former union with the spiritual world. Consider the Shankaya philosophy, or the system and discipline of yoga. It was the constant endeavour of the ancient Indian to rediscover his connection with the spiritual world from which he had emerged. He tried to disregard all that surrounded him in the world, to free himself from the links binding him to the world of the senses. By eliminating this world, he hoped to find again the spiritual realms from which he had descended, reunion with the world of spirit, release from the world of sense, such as yoga. Only when we see these principles as the fundamental tendencies of Indian spiritual life can we understand the mighty impulse of the Buddha as it flamed up in a last gleam across the evening skies of Indian spiritual life a few centuries before the Christ impulse was destined to dominate Western thought. We can only understand the nature of Buddha when we contemplate him in this setting. It was possible for a mode of thought and consciousness to arise on the soul of India that saw the world in the throes of decline, of a descent from spirit into Maya, the great illusion. It is also natural that, as the Indians looked at the external world with which human life is so closely interwoven, they should have evolved the idea that this descent from spirit into the world of Maya had proceeded stage by stage, as it were, passing from epoch to epoch. We can now understand the deeply devotional mood of Indian culture, a culture reflecting the glow of sunset, and how the concept of Buddhahood found a natural place there. The Indians looked back to an age when man was united with the spiritual world. Then they descended to a certain level, rose once again, sank, rose, sank, but in such a way that each descent was deeper than the last. According to ancient Indian wisdom, a Buddha appears whenever an epoch of decline draws to a close. Gautama Buddha, the most recent, was the being who incarnated as the son of King Suddhodana. The Indians look back to 5 former Buddhas who had appeared during the time of man's gradual descent from the spiritual world. Coming again and again into the world of men, they could bring them something of that primordial wisdom whereby they could be sustained in earthly life, and thus avoid becoming lost in Maya. Man lost this wisdom in his descending path of evolution, and, when lost, a new Buddha appeared. Gautama Buddha was the last to have lived on earth. In the course of many earthly lives, such a being as a Buddha must previously have reached the level of a bodhisattva before he can attain to Buddhahood. According to Eastern wisdom, Gautama Buddha was first a bodhisattva, and as such was born into the royal house of Suddhodana. By dint of inner effort he attained in his 29th year the illumination symbolically described as sitting under the Bodhi tree. The wisdom that arose from this event was then revealed in the great sermon of Benares. This bodhisattva rose to the dignity of Buddhahood in his 29th year, and was then able, as Buddha, to bring again to mankind a last remnant of the ancient wisdom. When in the coming centuries man again sinks so low that the last remnant of wisdom brought by Buddha disappears, another bodhisattva will rise to the dignity of Buddhahood in the future and be known as the Maitreya Buddha, according to Eastern wisdom. Legends tell us of all that was enacted in the soul of the last bodhisattva who was to become Gautama Buddha. Up to his 29th year he knew only the surroundings of his royal home. Human misery and suffering, all life's sorrows, were hidden from him. He grew up seeing only the joys of life. The bodhisattvic consciousness, teeming with the inner wisdom of former earthly lives, was ever present. The legend is well known, and we need only consider the main details. We read how Siddhartha left the royal palace and saw a corpse, something he had never seen before. At the sight of the corpse he realized that death consumes life, that the element of death enters the fruitfulness and power of increase of life. He saw a sick man. Disease eats its way into health. He saw an old man tottering wearily along his way. Age creeps into the freshness of youth. We must of course realize that he who was to become Buddha passed through all these experiences with bodhisattvic consciousness. Thus he learned that the destructive element of existence has its place in the wisdom-filled process of being and becoming. So deeply was his soul affected that he cried out, according to the legend, "Life is full of suffering." Let us try to enter into the soul of this bodhisattva. He possessed profound wisdom, although he was not as yet fully conscious of it. In his earlier years he had seen only the fruitfulness of life. Then he perceived the image of destruction and corruption. The feeling arose within his soul that all attainment of knowledge and wisdom leads man to increase in life. His soul was then filled with the idea of becoming a process of perpetual fruitfulness. The idea of fruitful growth proceeds from wisdom. Looking at the world, what do we see? Forces of destruction, sickness, old age, death, knowledge and wisdom surely cannot have brought these conditions into the world. They must have been caused by something else. So, because he was not yet fully conscious of his bodhisattvic wisdom, Siddhartha felt that man may be filled with wisdom, and through this wisdom be filled with ever-fruitful forces of growth. Life, however, reveals decay, sickness, death, and other destructive elements. Here was a mystery unfathomable even to the Bodhisattva. He had passed through many lives, had accumulated an ever-increasing store of wisdom through incarnation after incarnation, until he had reached a point where he could survey life from the very heights of existence. Yet when he left the palace and life in its grim realities stood before him, the meaning of it all did not wholly penetrate his consciousness. The accumulated knowledge and wisdom of earthly lives cannot, in effect, lead to the solution of the ultimate mysteries of existence. These mysteries lie hidden beyond the region of the life that passes from incarnation to incarnation. This conception, quickening in the soul of the great Gautama, led him finally to full illumination under the Bodhi tree. We may express the results of his wakened consciousness by saying, we are living in a world of illusion. We live life after life in this world of Maya, to which we have come from a spiritual existence. In this way, in this life, we may rise in spirit to infinite merit, but the wisdom of innumerable lives will never solve the great riddles of old age, sickness, and death. Gautama then realized that the doctrine of suffering was greater than the wisdom of a bodhisattva. In his illumination, he knew that all that is spread abroad in the world of illusion is not true wisdom. Even after countless births, outer existence gives us no understanding of suffering, nor can we release ourselves from pain. Outer existence contains something that is far removed from true wisdom. So it came about that the Buddha saw an element void of wisdom to be the cause of old age, sickness, and death. The wisdom of this world could never bring liberation. That could only proceed from something this world cannot give. So man must withdraw from outer existence and his repeated births. From this moment onward, Buddha saw that the doctrine of suffering was the principle necessary for the further progress of humanity. First, for existence, which seemed to him to be the cause of the suffering that had entered the world, was devoid of wisdom. On one side stood wisdom, on the other a meaningless thirst for existence. Thus he came to realize that only when man is liberated from the wheel of births can he be led to true redemption, to true freedom. Of itself, the highest earthly wisdom cannot save him from suffering. Buddha then sought the means whereby man could be led away from the scene of his successive births to another world, nirvana. This we must learn to understand correctly if we are to avoid the many fantastic ideas that have arisen in connection with it. One who has reached the point in life where he no longer thirsts for existence nor desires rebirth passes into nirvana. What is the nature of this world? According to Buddhism, the world of redemption and bliss eludes all descriptions derived from the world of sense and space that man knows in earthly life. Nothing in the physical world of space points to liberation. All the words man uses to describe the world around him must be silenced. They do not and cannot apply to the world of bliss. It is absolutely impossible to form an idea of the realm entered by one who has been liberated from the necessity for rebirth. Since it has no resemblance to anything in the objective world, it can only be characterized by the negative term, nirvana. A man enters nirvana only when everything that connects him with earthly existence has been blotted out. Yet for the Buddhist, nirvana is no empty void. Rather is it a life of bliss no words can describe. Here we have the crux of Buddhism and an expression of its pervading mood. From the Sermon of Benares, where it was taught for the first time, this doctrine of the suffering of life, of suffering and its cause in the thirst for existence, permeates all we know of Buddhism. Only one thing can lead to human progress. That is redemption from rebirth, and the first step towards achieving that goal is to follow a path of knowledge that leads beyond earthly wisdom. Treading this path, a man will find the means gradually to reach and enter nirvana. In other words, he may learn to use his earthly incarnations so that he is finally freed from their necessity. Turning now from this somewhat abstract conception of Buddhism to its fundamentals, we find that such an attitude towards life tends to isolate man and raises the question of the aims and destiny of his life as an individual personality in the world. How could it be otherwise in a conception of the world built upon such a foundation? It was believed that man had descended from spiritual heights to find himself in a world of Maya, from which the wisdom of a Buddha now and again could rescue him, as the last Buddha had taught. Such a conception of the goal of human striving can be characterized in no other way than to see it as isolating man from his whole environment, considering that his earthly embodiments followed a descending path in a descending earthly order. How did Buddha seek illumination? Not to consider this question is never to understand Buddha or Buddhism. He sought illumination, as we know, in complete isolation. He went out from his father's palace into solitude. All knowledge gained from previous lives had to be silenced in a life of solitude. There he sought an inner illumination of the soul that would reveal the mystery of the suffering world. The Buddha awaited in isolation the enlightenment that would reveal the cause of suffering inherent in the thirst for existence and rebirth burning in every individual soul. The world, too, thirsts for existence, and this is the cause of all the suffering and destructive elements in life. Now, we cannot understand the essential nature of Buddha's illumination and teaching without comparing it to Christianity. 600 years after the appearance of the great Buddha, quite different conditions were present. Man's whole attitude to the world and to his environment had changed. But how? We will characterize Buddha by the use of an abstract expression and say that the Buddhistic teaching sees the world as unhistorical. This is a characteristic of the whole Orient. There, history is not a process of descent from a higher to a lower level. It is rather an effort to attain a definite goal, a possibility of union with the whole world, with the past and with the future. Such is the Oriental conception of history, and the Buddhist stands there isolated and alone, concerned only with his individual life. In his individual existence, he strives for liberation from the thirst for existence, and thus from the cycles of his births. 600 years later, the Christian had quite a different attitude. Putting aside prejudices now widespread in the world, we may describe the Christian conception by saying that, insofar as it is based on the Old Testament, it points to a primal humanity in which man's relationship to the spiritual world was not at all the same as in later times. We read of this in the imagery of Genesis. The attitude of the Christian to the world is different from that of the Buddhist. The Christian says, "Wisdom, arising from the very nature of my soul, lives within it. Wisdom, knowledge, and morality arise within me as a result of the way I observe the world of sense and coordinate my impressions by my reasoning faculties." In a previous age, however, the constitution of the human soul was altogether different. Something happened then that cannot merely be called a descent from the divine spiritual heights into a world of Maya in the Buddhistic sense, but must be spoken of as the fall of man. The fall is bound up with the whole of human existence. Man feels that there are forces within him that had their origin in a far distant past. They were part of a process that caused the human being not merely to descend, but to descend in such a way that his relationship to the world was completely changed. If conditions existing before this event had prevailed, man would have been a different being today. The fall was due to man's sinning, even though he sinned unconsciously. Thus, in Christianity, we are concerned not merely with the direct descent that concerned Buddhist thought, but with an altered condition in which the factor of temptation plays an essential part. The Christian who pierces to the depths of Christianity must say that, because of an event that occurred untold ages ago, the subconscious workings of his soul are different from what they were designed to be. The Buddhist says, "From a state of union with the divine spiritual world, I have been transported into this world of Maya and illusion." The Christian says, "I've descended into this world, but had I descended in my original soul state, I should everywhere be able to look behind the illusion of physical appearances into reality and find the truth. Since another factor has entered into the process of descent, however, it is I myself who have turned this world into illusion." These two modes of thought are strikingly different. The Buddhist asks why this world is illusion, and is taught that illusion is its very nature. The Christian asks the same question, but realizes that the fault is his. His powers of cognition and the state of his soul no longer enable him to see the original reality. His actions are unfruitful. He himself has drawn a vow over illusion, over the world. The Buddhist says that the world is in itself the great illusion, therefore he must overcome the world. The Christian, however, feels himself in the world, and there he must seek his goal. When the Christian realizes that spiritual science can lead him to the knowledge of successive earthly lives, he can resolve to use them as a means whereby the goal of life may be attained. Because man has wandered so far from his primal state that his vision and actions have changed the world to Maya, he knows the world to be full of sorrow and error. Yet he need not alienate himself from this world in order to enter into blessedness. Rather must he overcome the forces that make him see the world as illusion, and thereby be led back to its true original nature. There is a higher man who, if he could look upon the world, would see it in its reality. He would not pass through an existence of sickness and death, but enjoy a life of health and the freshness of youth. But a vow has been drawn before this inner man because humanity took part in a certain event in the evolution of the world. Man is not an isolated entity, an individual, nor is the first for existence responsible for his present state. Indeed, he is one with all humanity, having shared in the original sin of the whole human race. So the Christian feels himself bound up with the whole historical course of humanity, realizing as he gazes into the future that he must again find the higher nature that his descent has fouled. "I must seek," he says, "not nirvana, but the higher man in me. I must find the way back to my higher self. Then will the world no longer be illusion but reality, and I will be able to overcome sorrow, sickness and death by my own efforts." The Christian seeks liberation from the lower self by awakening the vowed higher self, so that he may behold the world in its truth. How great a contrast there is here between the wisdom of Buddha and Paul's words, "Not I, but Christ in me," which express a consciousness that places man in the world as an individuality. The Buddhist says, man has descended from spiritual heights because the world had enticed him downwards. Therefore the world has implanted in him the thirst for existence must be overcome. He must leave this world. But the Christian says, it is not the fault of the world that I am as I am. The fault is mine. The Christian stands in the world acknowledging that beneath his ordinary consciousness a power is at work that once gave him a clairvoyant picture consciousness. He sinned, however, and thus lost this spiritual vision. If he would now reach his goal, he must make amends for his transgression. In his later life, a man does not feel it unjust that he should suffer from the faults of youthful actions that were committed in a different consciousness. Equally, in his present state, he should not feel it an injustice to atone for an act arising from an earlier consciousness that he no longer possesses because it has been replaced by intellect and reason. Atonement is only possible, however, when the will arises in him to press forward of his present ego consciousness to that higher state described in Paul's words, "Not I, but Christ in me." The Christian should say, "I have descended into conditions other than those ordained for me from the beginning. I must reascend, not with the help of the ego I now possess, but through a power that can live in me and lead me beyond this ego. This I can only do if Christ works in me, leading me to behold the world in its reality. In this way, the forces that have brought illness and death into the world can be overcome by what Christ fulfills in me." The innermost being of Buddhism only reveals itself when we compare it with Christianity. Then we can realize how it was possible for Lessing to express the words, "Is not all eternity mine?" That is to say, if I use the opportunities of successive embodiments to bring the Christ power to life within me, I shall reach at last the sphere of the eternal. This has hitherto eluded me, because I have covered myself with a vow. Reincarnation shines with a new radiance in the light of Christianity, and will indeed penetrate Christian culture ever more deeply as a spiritual scientific truth in the future. The point, however, is that the essential attitude of Buddhism makes the world responsible for Maya or illusion, whereas the Christian holds himself as man, responsible, knowing that the path of redemption lies in his innermost being. In the Christian sense, redemption is also a resurrection in that the ego reascends to the higher ego from which it has descended. The Buddhist believes in the original sin of the world and therefore seeks liberation. The conception of the Christian is historical. Human life is seen as linked both with an event of a prehistoric past and with a future event through which man may reach a point where his whole life will be illuminated by the being of Christ. Thus Christianity does not point to successive Buddhas, recapitulating more or less the same truths through successive epochs, but to a unique event that occurred in the course of human evolution. While the Buddhist pictures his Buddha sitting under the Bodhi tree, rising to enlightenment as an isolated individual, the Christian looks to Jesus of Nazareth, into whom the spirit of the cosmos descended. These two pictures, the Buddha under the Bodhi tree and the baptism by John in the Jordan, stand clearly before us. Buddha sits under the Bodhi tree in the solitude of his soul. Jesus of Nazareth stands in the waters of the Jordan, and the very spirit of the cosmos, the spirit in the image of the dove, descends into his inner being. The deed of the Buddha contained the message for his followers. Quench your thirst for existence, tear yourself away from earthly existence, and follow me to realms that no earthly words can describe. The Christian realizes that from the deed of Christ flows redemption from the original sin of man, and he feels, if the influx of the spiritual world behind the physical grows as strong within me as it was in Christ, I shall carry into my future incarnations a force that will enable me to say with Paul, "Not I, but Christ in me." So shall I rise to the spiritual world from which I descended. The words of Buddha, spoken to his intimate disciples, are deeply moving in this light. Page after page I look back upon my former lives as upon an open book. I see how in life after life I built a material body, wherein my spirit dwelt as in a temple. Now I know that this body in which I have become Buddha is the last. Referring to his passing to Nirvana, he said, "The beams are breaking, the posts are giving way, the material body has been built for the last time, and will now be entirely destroyed. Compare these words with a pronouncement of the Christ recorded in the Gospel of St. John. Christ indicates that he is living in an outer body. Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will build it up again. Here we have exactly the opposite conception, since it can be interpreted thus: I shall accomplish a deed that will make fruitful and living all that from God, from my primeval humanity, flows into this world and into us. These words indicate that the Christian, through repeated earthly lives, comes in truth to be able to say, not I, but Christ in me. We must, however, understand that the rebuilding of this temple has an eternal significance, and that it points to the Christ being poured into all who share in the collective evolution of humankind. There can be no repetition of the Christ event in the cause of evolution. The true Buddhist assumes the repetition of earthly epochs, a succession of Buddhas, each having a fundamentally similar mission. But the Christian looks back to the fall of man, and must point also to a further and unique event, the mystery of Golgotha, and man's redemption from the fall. There have been times in the past, even indeed in our own days, when men have looked for a renewal of the Christ event. Such an expectation, however, can only arise from a misunderstanding of the basic facts of man's historical progress. True history must take its start and pursue its course from a central point. Just as there must be one point of balance for a pair of scales, so in history there must be one event to which both the past and the future point. To imagine that the Christ event could be repeated is as meaningless as to suppose that there could be two focal points in a balance. Eastern wisdom speaks of a succession of similar individualities, the Buddhas. The Christ impulse, however, is a unique event. To deny this is to deny historical progress and evolution, and to hold a false idea of history. Herein lies the difference between the Eastern and Western conceptions of the universe. The consciousness of the fact that the individual is indissolubly bound up with humanity as a whole, that not mere repetition but a great purpose rules throughout the course of evolution, is Christian in the deepest sense and cannot be separated from Christianity. Human progress is inherent in the fact that an older Eastern conception has evolved into a new one. Man has advanced from thinking that the wheels of world events roll on in an endless repetition to the belief that there is meaning and progressive significance in the changing events of human existence. Thus, Christianity gives reality to the doctrine of repeated earthly lives. Now we say that man passes through repeated lives on earth in order that the true meaning of human life may repeatedly be implanted in him, each time as a fresh experience. Not only the isolated individual strives upward, but yet deeper meaning lies in the striving of humanity as a whole, and we ourselves are bound up with it. No longer feeling himself united with a Buddha who urges liberation from the world, man, gazing at the central spiritual sun, at the Christ impulse, grows conscious of his union with the one whose deed has balanced the event symbolized in the fall. Buddhism can be best described as the sunset of a mode of thought that was nearing its decline but flamed into a mighty glow when Gautama Buddha appeared. This is not to honour the Buddha less. We revere him as the exalted spirit who once brought to man a teaching pointing to the past, and also a sense of union with a primeval wisdom. The Christ impulse points with the hand of power to the future. It must live with ever-increasing strength in the soul until man realizes that not redemption but resurrection, the transfiguration of material existence, can alone give meaning to his earthly life. Concepts or dogmas are not the only driving forces in life, even though many may be more attracted to Buddhism than to Christianity. The essentials are rather such impulses, perceptions, and feelings as give meaning to human evolution. There is, indeed, something of a Buddha mood today in many souls that draw them towards Buddhism. Goethe, however, could not feel this mood. Through his recognition that the spirit, which is the source of the human spirit, also permeates all external things, he could greatly love life. During his first day in Weimar, freeing himself from all narrowness and prejudice, he closely studied the outer world. He passed from plant to plant, from mineral to mineral, seeking behind them the spirit from which the spirit of man descends, and with this omnipresent spirit he sought to unite himself. Goethe once said to his pupil Schopenhauer, "All your splendid conceptions will be at war with themselves as soon as they pass into other minds." Schopenhauer's motto can best be expressed in his own words. Life is full of perplexity. I try to make it easier through contemplation. Searching for an explanation of the origin of existence, he turned naturally to Buddhism, and his ideas assumed a Buddhistic colouring. In the course of the 19th century, the different branches of culture yielded such powerful results that the human mind was unable to assimilate the mass of scientific achievements that poured in from external research. The sense of helplessness thus brought about continually increased before the overwhelming mass of scientific facts. True, this world of facts tallies in a wonderful way with spiritual science. But we also see that thought in the 19th century was not equal to cope with it. Man came to realize that his faculties of knowledge could not assimilate all the facts, nor could his mind gauge them. Thus he began to seek a philosophy or world conception that did not attempt to wrestle with them. In contrast, spiritual science takes its start from the deepest principles and experiences of spiritual knowledge. It is able to encompass and elaborate all facts brought to light by outer science, and to show how the spirit lives in outer reality. Many people do not like this. At least so far as knowledge is concerned, they draw back from the investigation of the world of facts and strive to reach a higher stage merely in their inner beings through soul development. This has led to an unconscious Buddhism, which has been in existence for some time now. We can find traces of it in the philosophies of the 19th and 20th centuries. When such people, and they really are unconscious Buddhists, come into contact with Buddhism, their longing for ease draws them more readily to this mode of thought than to spiritual science, which deals with all the facts and with the knowledge that spirit manifests in all of them. It is really, therefore, an element of unbelief and paralysis of will, born of a feeble spiritual knowledge, that awakens the attraction to Buddhism today. Contrariwise, the Christian conception of the universe as it lived in Goethe, for instance, demands that man should not give way to his weakness and speak of boundaries of knowledge, but rather feel that something within him can rise above all illusion and lead to truth and wisdom. True, a certain amount of resignation is demanded here, but not the resignation that shrinks back before the boundaries of knowledge. In the Kantian sense, resignation means that man is altogether unable to penetrate the depths of the universe. This is resignation born of weakness. There is, however, another sort of resignation, whereby man can say with Goethe, "I have not yet reached the stage where the world can be known in its truth, yet I can evolve to it." Through this resignation he is led to the stage where he can bring the higher man, the Christ man, to birth within himself. He is resigned because he knows that at the moment he has not reached this highest level of human life. This indeed is heroic resignation in that it points to the fact that we pass from life to life with the feeling that we exist, and we know as we look toward the future that in the repetition of earthly existence all eternity is ours. So two great streams of thought can be seen in human evolution. One is represented by Schopenhauer, who says, "This world with all its suffering is such that we can only know man's real position through the works of great painters." They portray figures whose asceticism brought something like freedom from earthly existence, and they are lifted above terrestrial life. According to Schopenhauer, the greatest of this liberated human being consists in the fact that he is able to look back upon his earthly existence and to feel that his bodily covering is nothing but an empty shell that has no significance for him. He strives upward in anticipation of the state he shall attain when earthly existence has been conquered, and he has overcome all that is connected with it. In this is the great liberation, when nothing remains to remind him in the future of his earthly existence. Such was Schopenhauer's conception, permeated as he was with the mood Buddhism had brought into the world. Goethe, however, stimulated by a purely Christian impulse, looked out upon the world as did Faust. If we, in our time, rise above external trivialities, through realizing that our works will perish when the earth has become a corpse, we can also say with Goethe that we learn from our experiences on earth. What we build on earth must perish, but what we acquire in the school of life does not. Like Faust, we do not look upon the permanency of our works, but upon their fruits in the eternity of the soul. Gazing at horizons wider than those of Buddhism, we can say with Goethe, "Aeons cannot obliterate the traces of a man's days on earth." Lecture 4. Bodhisattvas, Buddhas and Christ. Today I want to speak of certain facts belonging essentially to the ethical and moral domain that help us to understand the mission of spiritual science in our time. We are all deeply convinced of the great truth of reincarnation, and so must realize that this repetition of earthly lives has its own good purpose in the evolution of the earth. Occult research answers the question as to why we reincarnate by saying that our experiences differ in each of the epochs in which we are reborn on the earth. In incarnations immediately following the Atlantean catastrophe, the experiences of the human soul are entirely different from those of later pre-Christian epochs, and in our own age. I need only briefly mention that in the times directly after the Atlantean catastrophe, souls were endowed with a certain elementary clairvoyance in the bodies they then inhabited. This clairvoyance, once a natural faculty in man, was gradually lost mainly as a result of the conditions prevailing during the Greco-Roman epoch of culture. Since then, man has developed in such a way that great progress has been achieved on the physical plane, and during the course of the present post-Atlantean epoch, clairvoyance will gradually be reacquired. We are living in the fifth post-Atlantean epoch of culture. The ancient Indian was the first, the ancient Persian the second, the Babylonian Chaldean the third, and the Greco-Roman the fourth. The sixth and seventh epochs will follow our own, at which time another great catastrophe will befall the earth and humanity, as was the case at the end of the Atlantean epoch. Occult research is able to indicate the characteristic trend of human evolution in each of these post-Atlantean epochs of civilization, including the fifth, sixth and seventh. The essential characteristic of our present fifth epoch is the development of intellect and reason. The main characteristic of the sixth will be that definite feelings regarding what is moral and what is immoral will arise in the souls of men. Delicate feelings of sympathy will be aroused by compassionate, kindly deeds, and feelings of antipathy by malicious actions. Nobody today has the faintest conception of the intensity of these feelings. In the seventh epoch, the moral life will be still further deepened, whereas in the sixth epoch man will take pleasure in good and noble actions. In the seventh, the natural outcome of such pleasure will be a moral impulse. In other words, there will be a firm resolve to do what is moral. There is a great difference between taking pleasure in a moral action and the doing of it. So we can say that our own epoch is the epoch of intellectualism. The essential characteristic of the following epoch will be aesthetic pleasure in the good and aesthetic displeasure in the evil. The seventh will be characterized by an active moral life. Today, only the seeds of what will become part of mankind in future epochs are contained in the human soul, and it can be said that all these intellectual aptitudes or predispositions in man leading to feelings of sympathy or antipathy towards moral impulses aroused by certain actions are related to the higher worlds. Every moral action has a definite connection with the higher worlds. Our intellectual aptitudes have a supersensible connection with the astral plane. Our sympathies and antipathies for good or evil are connected with the sphere of lower devacham, and the domain of moral impulses in the soul is connected with higher devacham. Hence we can also say that in our present age it is mainly the forces of the astral world that penetrate the human soul and take effect there. In the sixth epoch it will be the forces of lower devachan that penetrate more deeply into the soul, and in the seventh the forces of higher devachan will work with special strength into humanity. From this it is understandable that in the preceding fourth post-Atlantean epoch it was the forces of the physical plane that exercised the strongest influence on the soul of man. That is why Greek culture was able to produce such wonderful sculptures in which the human form was given such magnificent expression on the physical plane. Conditions in that epoch were especially suitable for men to experience the Christ in a physical body. In our present fifth epoch, which will last until the fourth millennium, souls will gradually become able, from the 20th century onward, to experience the Christ being in an etheric form on the astral plane, just as in the fourth epoch he was visible in a physical form on the physical plane. To understand the nature of development in the sixth epoch, it is well to consider the characteristic qualities of the soul in future incarnations. In our intellectual age today, intellectuality and morality are practically separate spheres in the life of the soul. It is quite possible for a man to be clever and at the same time immoral, or vice versa, to be deeply moral and anything but clever. In the fourth epoch, the future juxtaposition of morality and intellectuality was prophetically foreseen by the Hebrews. They endeavoured to bring about an artificial harmony between morality and intellectuality, whereas among the Greeks it was a more natural matter of course. Today we can learn from the Akashic Chronicle how the leaders of the ancient Hebrews strove to establish this harmony between intellectuality and morality. They wore symbols which they understood so profoundly that when they concentrated their attention on them, making themselves receptive to their influences, a certain harmony was established between what was good in a moral sense and what was wise. The ancient Hebrew priests wore these symbols on their breastplates. The symbol for morality was called Urim, and for wisdom, Thummim. When a Hebrew priest wanted to learn whether or not a certain action was both good and wise, he made himself receptive to the forces of Urim and Thummim, with the result that a certain harmony between morality and intellectuality was induced. Magical effects were produced by means of these symbols, and a magical link thus established with the spiritual world. Our task in future incarnations is to achieve through inner development of the soul the effect that in earlier times was produced by means of these symbols. Let us think once again of the fifth, sixth and seventh post-Atlantean epochs in order to grasp the way in which intellectuality, aestheticism and morality will come to expression in man's soul life. In the present fifth epoch, intellectuality can remain unimpaired even if no pleasure is taken in moral actions. In the sixth epoch it will be quite different, in that from about the third millennium onward, immorality will have a paralyzing effect on intellectuality. The mental abilities of a man who is intellectual and at the same time immoral will definitely deteriorate, and this condition will become gradually more pronounced as man evolves. A man who has no morals will then have no intellectual power, since this will depend entirely on moral actions. In the seventh epoch, cleverness without morality will be in non-existence. It will be well to consider here the nature of moral forces in souls in their present incarnations. How can it be that at our stage of evolution a person can become immoral? It is because in earlier incarnations we have gradually descended into the physical sensory world. The more forcefully the impulses belonging to the descending phase of evolution work upon a soul, the more immoral it tends to become. This fact is confirmed by an interesting finding of occult research. You know that when a man passes through the gate of death, he lays aside his physical and etheric bodies, and for a short time has a retrospective view of his past life on earth. A kind of sleep then ensues, and after a few months or perhaps years, he wakens on the astral plane in Kamaloka. The earthly life just departed is lived over again in backward order, 3 times as fast. At the beginning of this life in Kamaloka, everyone undergoes a significant experience. Most Europeans, or speaking generally, people of modern civilization, experience this as follows. At the beginning of life in Kamaloka, a spiritual individuality shows us a kind of register of our transgressions, in which is inscribed everything we have done out of selfish motives. The more concretely you picture this experience, the better. At the beginning of the Kamaloka period, it is actually as though an individual were presenting you with the register of your physical life. The important fact, for which naturally there can be no further proof because it can be confirmed only by occult experience, is that the majority of Europeans recognize this individual to be Moses. It is an actual fact in occult life that it is the individuality of Moses who demands reckoning for the wrongs committed in our time. This has been known to Rosicrucian research since the Middle Ages, and it has been confirmed in recent years by quite delicate investigations. You can gather from this that at the beginning of his life in Kamaloka, a man feels a great responsibility towards the pre-Christian powers for having allowed him to be drawn downward. The powers and forces that draw men upward again to the spiritual world fall into 2 categories. The one path is that of wisdom, the other that of morality. The forces to which intellectual progress is mainly due all proceed from the impulse given by a great individuality of the 4th post-Atlantean epoch, who is known to all of you, namely Gautama Buddha. It is a remarkable discovery of spiritual investigation to find that the most penetrating and significant faults conceived in our present epoch originated with Gautama Buddha. This is all the more remarkable inasmuch as his name was almost unknown in the West before Schopenhauer's time, by no means long ago. As we know, Siddhartha, the son of King Suddhodana, rose from the rank of a bodhisattva to that of Buddha when he was 29 years old. An individual who has been raised to Buddhahood does not incarnate again on earth in a physical body. The bodhisattva individuality who became Buddha 5 or 6 centuries before the Christian era has not reincarnated, nor can he incarnate again in a physical body. Instead, he sends his forces down from the higher supersensible worlds, inspiring all those cultured individuals who are not yet permeated by the Christ impulse. Consciousness of this truth was demonstrated in a beautiful legend written by John of Damascus in the 8th century, and well known throughout Europe in the Middle Ages. This legend of Balaam and Josaphat related how the successor of Buddha, Josaphat, whose name is a phonetic variation of Bodhisattva, received instructions from Balaam about the Christ impulse. The legend was subsequently forgotten, but it told how the Bodhisattva who succeeded Gautama Buddha was instructed by Balaam, and his soul was fired by the Christ impulse. In addition to the impulse of Buddha, this Christ impulse, which is connected with the future ascent of man to morality, also continued to work in man's evolution, although Buddha's teaching is, in a particular sense, moral teaching. The Christ impulse is not a teaching, but actual power. It works as such, and to an increasing degree imbues man with moral strength. In the fourth post-Atlantean epoch, the Christ being who descended from cosmic heights had first to appear in a physical body. In our fifth epoch, the intense consolidation of intellectual forces will make it possible for men to behold the Christ in an etheric form. This is beginning even now in our century. From the 30s to the 40s of this century onward, individuals will appear who have developed in a way that will enable them to see the etheric form of Christ, just as they saw the physical Christ at the time of Jesus of Nazareth. During the next 3,000 years, those able to behold the etheric Christ will steadily increase until in about 3,000 years from now, a plentiful number of human beings on earth will not need Gospels or such records. They will possess in their own soul lives an actual vision of the Christ. We must clearly understand that in the fourth post-Atlantean epoch, men were only capable of beholding the physical Christ, and so he came to a physical body. In our own epoch, and on into the third millennium, they will gradually become able to behold the etheric Christ. He will never come again in a physical body. If we bear in mind the fact that when a man of the present age, who has united himself deeply with the Christ impulse, passes into Kamaloka and is called to account by a figure personifying a moral force, by Moses, we shall understand how a transformation of the Moses individuality can be brought about. What does Moses show us when he confronts us with the register of our sins and transgressions? He reveals the debit side of our karmas. For a soul of our epoch, it is of great significance that through the inspiration of Buddha, the doctrine of karma can be comprehended. The reality of the working of karma after death, however, is revealed to us by Moses of the Old Testament. As the influences of the supersensible Christ increasingly pervade the souls of men, the figure of Moses will be replaced after death by that of Christ Jesus. This means that human karma will be linked with Christ. Christ will unite with our karmas. It is interesting to realize that in the teachings of Buddha, karma is an abstract matter having an impersonal character. In the future incarnations of men, as Christ comes into ever more closer connection with karma, it will acquire the quality of being, that is, of potential life. Our earlier stages of evolution, our lives in the past, may be related to the words ex deo nascimur. If we direct our development in such a way that after death, instead of Moses, we meet Christ, with whom our karmas are then united, we can express it in the words used in Rosicrucian Christianity since the 13th century. In Christo morimur. Buddhahood can be attained only on the physical plane. The qualification for meeting Christ in death can likewise be acquired by the human soul only on the physical plane. A Buddha is first a Bodhisattva and rises to the rank of Buddha during a physical incarnation. It is then no longer necessary for him to return to the earth. Understanding of Christ in the sense just explained can be acquired only on the physical plane. Hence, during the next 3,000 years, men will have to acquire in the physical world the power to behold the supersensible Christ. It is the mission of the anthroposophical movement to create, first of all, the conditions that make understanding of Christ possible on the physical plane, and then to make possible the power to behold him. In our age, the etheric Christ works in the world of men. If, on the physical plane, we have acquired the capacity to behold him, we can then do so while living in a physical body, or when we are between death and a new birth. Let us suppose, for example, that a man died before it was possible to behold Christ in his present etheric form. Nevertheless, if during his life in the physical world he had acquired the necessary understanding, vision of the Christ would be possible for him between death and rebirth. A man, however, who keeps aloof from spiritual life and acquires no understanding of Christ will have to wait until his next incarnation to acquire it. What has just been said will indicate that as humanity lives on through the 5th, 6th and 7th epochs of civilization, the Christ impulse will gain increasing power on the earth. We have heard that in the 6th epoch, intellectuality will be impaired through immorality. The other aspect is that a man who has paralyzed his intellectual faculty as a result of immorality must turn to Christ with all the greater determination, so that he may imbue him with the moral strength to return to morality. What I have told you here has been carefully investigated by Rosicrucians ever since the 13th century. It is a truth, however, that has always been known to many occultists. If it were to be asserted that Christ could appear again on earth in a physical body, it would, according to occultism, be equivalent to asserting that a balance works more efficiently when supported at 2 points rather than 1. In very truth, the 3 years of Christ's life on earth in the body of Jesus of Nazareth constitutes the fulcrum of earth evolution. Just as there can be only 1 point at which the beam of a balance is attached, so there can be only 1 fulcrum of earth evolution. The teaching of moral development is not the same as the impulse for such development. Before the event of Golgotha occurred, the Bodhisattva, who is the successor of Buddha, was incarnated on earth to teach and prepare those around him for that event. He incarnated in the personality of Jeshua B. Pandira, 1 century before the birth of Jesus of Nazareth. Thus we must distinguish between the Jeshua ben Pandera incarnation of the Bodhisattva who succeeded Gautama Buddha, and the incarnation of Jesus of Nazareth, who for 3 years was permeated by the cosmic being we call the Christ. This Bodhisattva, who incarnated in Jeshu ben Pandera, and also in others, returns repeatedly. In about 3,000 years hence he will attain Buddhahood, and as the Maitreya Buddha will live through his final incarnation. The Christ individuality was on earth in the body of Jesus of Nazareth for only 3 years, and will not come again in a physical body. In the 5th post-Atlantean epoch he will come in an etheric body, in the 6th in an astral body, and in the 7th in a mighty cosmic ego that will be like a great group soul of humanity. When a man dies, his physical, etheric and astral bodies fall away from him, and his ego passes over to the next incarnation. It is exactly the same with the earth. What is physical in our earth falls away at the end of the earth period, and human souls in their totality pass over into the Jupiter condition, the next planetary embodiment. Just as the ego of an individual man is the centre of his further evolution, so for the whole of future humanity, the Christ ego in the astral and etheric bodies of men goes on to ensoul the Jupiter existence. So we see how, starting from a physical man on earth, the Christ gradually evolves as etheric Christ, astral Christ, and ego Christ, to become the spirit of the earth who then rises to even higher stages together with all mankind. What are we doing when we profess spiritual science today, but teaching what Oriental wisdom so clearly proclaimed, when the Bodhisattva, the son of King Suddhodana, attained Buddhahood? The realization was expressed in those Oriental teachings that it was the task of the next Bodhisattva, who would also eventually become a Buddha, to spread over the earth the knowledge that would reveal Christ to men in the true light. Thus the Bodhisattva who incarnated in Jeshua ben Pandera and in others became the great teacher of the Christ impulse. This is clearly indicated in the legend of Balaam and Josaphat that tells how Josaphat, the Bodhisattva, is instructed by Balaam, the Christian teacher. Oriental occult teachings call this Bodhisattva, who will become the Maitreya Buddha, the bringer of the good. We know from occult investigations that the power of the word will be present in Maitreya Buddha in a degree of which men of today can as yet have no conception. Through higher clairvoyant perception of the process of world evolution, it is possible to discover how the Maitreya Buddha will teach 3,000 years from now. Much of his teaching can also be expressed in symbolic forms. But because mankind today is insufficiently mature, it is not yet possible to speak words such as those that will come from the lips of the Maitreya Buddha. In the Eightfold Path, Gautama Buddha gave the great intellectual teachings of right speech, right thinking, right action, etc. The words of the Maitreya Buddha will contain a magic power that will become moral impulses in the men who hear them. Should there be a gospel telling of the Maitreya Buddha, it would have to use different words than those used by Christ in the Gospel of St. John, and the Word was made flesh. The evangelist of the Maitreya Buddha would have to testify, and the flesh was made word. The pronouncements of the Maitreya Buddha will be permeated in a miraculous way with the power of Christ. Occult investigations today show that in a certain respect even the external life of the Maitreya Buddha will be patterned on the life of Christ. When in ancient times a great individuality appeared who was to become a teacher of humanity, it was indicated by signs, special talents and qualities of soul evident in his early youth. But there is also a different development in which a complete change in personality becomes apparent at a certain point in life. In such instances, when the individual has reached a certain age, his ego is removed from his bodily sheaths and is replaced by another. Jesus is the most outstanding example of this development, in that in his 30th year, the Christ individuality took possession of him. All the incarnations of the Bodhisattva who will become the Maitreya Buddha have shown that in this sense his life too will resemble that of Christ. It is never known during the childhood or youth of an individual that he will become a Bodhisattva at the age of 30 or thereabouts. Also, whenever a Bodhisattva reaches Buddhahood, there is evidence that at the age of 30 or 31, another individuality takes possession of his body. Such a Bodhisattva will never reveal himself in his early youth, but in his 30th or 31st year he will manifest quite different qualities because another being has taken possession of his body. Other individualities who will not incarnate as children, but who will take possession of the personality of some human being in this way are, for example, Moses, Abraham, and Ezekiel. Today it is the same in the case of the Bodhisattva, who in 3,000 years will become the Maitreya Buddha. It will be sheer occult dilettantism to assert that this being will be recognizable in his early years as the Bodhisattva, but between his 30th and 31st years he will reveal himself through his own power without having to be proclaimed by others. He will convince the world through his own power, and if he were alleged by some to reveal himself in someone under the age of 30, that fact alone would be evidence of the fallacy of such a statement. Claims like this have frequently been made. In the 17th century, for example, Shabbatai Svayavi in Smyrna proclaimed himself to be an incarnation of the Messiah, or Christ. Hosts of people from all over Europe made pilgrimages to him in Smyrna. It is certainly true that today there is a rooted disinclination to recognize genius in people. But, on the other hand, mental laziness is prevalent, with the result that people are only too ready to acknowledge some individual or other as a great soul merely on authority. It is important for anthroposophy to be presented in such a way as to be based on the smallest possible extent on belief in authority. Much that I have said today can be substantiated only by means of occult investigation. Yet I beg you not to give credence to these things because I say them, but to test them by everything known to you from history, above all, by what you can learn from your own experience. I am absolutely certain that the more closely you examine them, the more confirmation you will find. In this age of intellectualism, I do not appeal to your belief in authority, but to your capacity for intelligent examination. So let me repeat what I have already said. The Bodhisattva of the 20th century will not rely upon a herald to announce him as the future Maitreya Buddha, but upon the power of his own words. He will stand on his own feet in the world. What has been said here may perhaps be summed up as follows. In our period of evolution, two streams of spiritual life are at work. One of them is the stream of wisdom, or the Buddha stream, containing the most sublime teaching of wisdom, goodness of heart, and peace on earth. To enable this teaching of Buddha to permeate the hearts of all men, the Christ impulse is indispensable. The second stream is the Christ stream itself that will lead humanity from intellectuality by way of aesthetic feeling and insight to morality. The greatest teacher of the Christ impulse will be that Bodhisattva who incarnates again and again, and who in 3,000 years will become the Maitreya Buddha. The statement contained in Oriental Chronicles is true. Exactly 5,000 years after Gautama Buddha attained enlightenment under the Bodhi tree, the Maitreya Buddha will incarnate on earth for the last time. The succession of Bodhisattvas and Buddhas has no relation to the cosmic being we call Christ. It was a Bodhisattva, not the Christ, who incarnated in the body of Jeshua ben Pandera. Christ incarnated in a physical body only once for a period of 3 years. The Bodhisattva appears in every century until he becomes the Maitreya Buddha. The mission of anthroposophy today is to bring about a synthesis of religions. We can conceive of one form of religion in Buddhism, another form in Christianity. As evolution proceeds, the more closely do the different religions unite in the way that Buddha and Christ themselves are united in our hearts. This vista of the spiritual development of humanity brings home to us the need for the impulse of anthroposophy as a preparation for understanding the progress of culture and events in the great process of evolution. Lecture 5. The Mission of Gautama Buddha on Mars. Friends have expressed the wish that I should speak today on the subject of the lecture given here a year ago, when it was said that the initiation of Christian Rosenkreuz took place in special circumstances in the 13th century, and that since then this individuality has worked unceasingly in spiritual life. Today we shall hear still more of Christian Rosenkreuz, as we study the prodigious task that devolved upon him at the dawn of the age of intellect, so that provision might be made for the future of humanity. A being like Christian Rosenkreuz, living in the world as a noble and eminent occultist, has to reckon with the conditions peculiar to his epoch. The intrinsic character of spiritual life today appeared for the first time when modern natural science came into being through men like Copernicus, Giordano Bruno, Galileo, and others. Children are taught about Copernicus in their early school days, and the impressions they receive remain with them throughout life. In earlier times it was quite different. Try to picture what a contrast there is between a man of the modern age and one who lived centuries ago. Before the time of Copernicus, everyone believed that the earth remained at rest in cosmic space, with the sun and planets revolving around. The ground slipped from under men's feet when Copernicus presented the doctrine that claimed the earth to be moving with tremendous speed through the universe. We should not underestimate the effects of such a revolution in thinking, with its accompanying corresponding change in the life of feeling. All thoughts and ideas were suddenly different from what they had been before the days of Copernicus. Now let us ask what occultism has to say about this revolution in thinking. One who asks from the standpoint of occultism what world conception can be derived from the Copernican tenets will have to admit that, although these ideas can lead to great achievements in the realms of natural science and external life, they are incapable of promoting an understanding of the spiritual foundations of the world and things in it. Truth to tell, there has never, in the evolution of the human mind, been a worse instrument for understanding the spiritual foundations of the world than the ideas of Copernicus. This is because all these Copernican concepts are inspired by Lucifer. Copernicanism is one of the last and strongest attacks made by Lucifer upon the evolution of man. In earlier pre-Copernican thought, the external world was indeed Maya, but much traditional wisdom and truth concerning the world and its effects still survived. Since Copernicus, however, men have been surrounded by Maya, not only in their material perceptions, but their concepts and ideas in themselves are also illusions. Today it is self-evident to men that the sun stands firmly central, and the planets revolve in ellipses around it. In no far distant future, however, it will be realized that the Copernican view of the solar world is much less correct than the earlier Ptolemaic view. The conception of the world held by the school of Copernicus and Kepler is, in many respects, convenient, but as an explanation of the macrocosm, it is not the truth. So Christian Rosenkreuz, confronted by a world conception that is itself a Maya, was obliged to take a stand with regard to it. It devolved upon him to rescue occultism in an age when all the concepts of science were illusions, for with its material globes in cosmic space, the Copernican world system was Maya, even as concept. Thus, toward the end of the 16th century, one of those conferences took place that we heard of here a year ago in connection with the initiation of Christian Rosenkreuz in the 13th century. In this latter occult conference of leading individualities, Christian Rosenkreuz was associated with certain eminent individualities who were concerned with the leadership of humanity. Personalities in incarnation on the physical plane were present, and also intelliges operating in the spiritual worlds, including the individuality who in the 6th century before Christ had been incarnated as Gautama Buddha. Because they know it to be the truth, the occultists of the East rightly believed that the Buddha, who in his 29th year rose from the rank of Bodhisattva to that of Buddha, had incarnated then for the last time in a physical body. It is absolutely true that when the individuality of a Bodhisattva becomes a Buddha, he ceases to incarnate in a physical body on earth. But this does not mean that he ceases to be active in the affairs of the earth. The Buddha continues to work for the earth, sending down his influences from the spiritual worlds, even though he will never again be present in a physical body. The Gloria, heard by the shepherds in the fields, proclaimed from the spiritual world that the forces of Buddha were streaming into the astral body of the Jesus child described in St. Luke's Gospel. The words of the Gloria came from Buddha, who was working in the astral body of the Jesus child. This wonderful message of peace and love is an integral part of Buddha's contribution to Christianity. Later on, too, the Buddha worked into the deeds of men from the spiritual world, and he has cooperated in measures that have been necessary for the sake of progress in the evolution of humanity. In the 7th and 8th centuries, for example, there was an important centre of initiation in the neighbourhood of the Black Sea, in which the Buddha taught in his spiritual body. In such schools there are teachers who live in physical bodies, but it is also possible for the more advanced pupils to receive instruction from one who teaches only in an etheric body. Among the pupils of the Buddha at that time was one who incarnated again a few centuries later. We are speaking of a physical personality who centuries later lived again in a physical body, and who is known to us as Francis of Assisi. The characteristic quality of Francis of Assisi and of the life of his monks, which is so similar to that of the disciples of Buddha, is due to the fact that Francis himself was a pupil of Buddha. It is easy to perceive the contrast between the qualities characteristic of men who, like Francis of Assisi, were striving fervently for the spirit, and those engrossed in the world of industry, technical life, and discoveries of modern civilization. Consequently, there were many, including occultists, who suffered deeply at the thought that in the future two separate classes of human beings would inevitably arise. They foresaw one class wholly given up to the affairs of practical life, and convinced that security depends entirely upon the production of nourishment, the construction of machines, etc. The other would be composed of men who, like Francis of Assisi, withdraw altogether from the practical affairs of the world for the sake of leading a spiritual life. Left to itself without intervention, human history would inevitably have taken this course. But in the wise councils of the spiritual worlds, steps were taken to avert the worst form of this evil on the earth. A conference of the most advanced individualities were called together by Christian Rosenkreuz. His most intimate pupil and friend, the eminent teacher Buddha, participated in these councils and in the decisions that were reached. At that spiritual conference it was resolved that henceforward Buddha would dwell on Mars and there unfold his influence and activity. He transferred his work to Mars in the year 1604 and performed a deed there similar to that of Christ in the mystery of Golgotha on earth. Christian Rosenkreuz knew what the work of Buddha on Mars would signify for the entire cosmos, what his teachings of nirvana and liberation from the earth would signify on Mars. The teaching of nirvana was unsuited to a culture directed primarily to practical life. Buddha's pupil, Francis of Assisi, was an example of the fact that this teaching produced adepts who were completely remote from the world and its affairs. But the content of this Buddhism, which was so unsuited to the practical life of man between birth and death, was of essential importance for the soul between death and a new birth. Christian Rosenkreuz realized that to bring about a certain purification needed on Mars, the teachings of Buddha were eminently suitable. The Christ being, the essence of divine love, had once descended to the earth to a people who were in many respects alien. In the 17th century, Buddha, the Prince of Peace, went to the planet of war and conflict, Mars, to execute his mission there where souls were warlike and torn with strife. Thus Buddha performed a deed of sacrifice similar to the deed performed in the mystery of Golgotha by the bearer of the essence of divine love, Christ. To dwell on Mars as Buddha was a deed of sacrifice offered to the cosmos. He was, as it were, the lamb offered up in sacrifice on Mars, and to accept this environment of strife was for him a kind of crucifixion. He undertook this deed on Mars in the service of Christian Rosenkreuz. So do the exalted beings who guide the world work together, not only on Earth, but from one planet to another. Since the consummation of the mystery of Mars by Gautama Buddha, men have been able to receive different forces from Mars during the period between death and a new birth. Not only does a man bring with him into a new birth quite different forces from Mars, but because of the influence exercised by the spiritual deed of Buddha, forces also stream from Mars into men who practice meditation as a means for reaching the spiritual world. When, for example, the modern pupil of spiritual science meditates in the sense indicated by Christian Rosenkreuz, forces sent to the earth by Buddha as the Redeemer of Mars stream to him. Christian Rosenkreuz is thus revealed to us as a devoted servant of Christ Jesus. The work performed by him in the service of Christ Jesus, however, was also helped by the contribution of his emissary, the Buddha. The soul of Gautama Buddha has not incarnated again in a physical body on earth, but he is nevertheless fully dedicated to the work of the Christ impulse. What was the word of peace sent forth from Buddha to the Jesus child described in the Gospel of St. Luke? Glory in the heights and on the earth, peace. This word of peace, issuing mysteriously from Buddha, resounds from the planet of war and conflict to the souls of men on earth. Because of the occurrence of these events, it was possible to avert the separation of men into two distinct classes, the one consisting of men like Francis of Assisi, and the other men involved entirely in materialism. If Buddha had remained in direct and immediate connection with the earth, he would not have been able to concern himself with the men of practical affairs, and his influence would have turned the others into monks like Francis of Assisi. Through the deed of redemption performed by Gautama Buddha on Mars, it is possible for us, when passing through the Mars sphere between death and new birth, to become followers of Francis of Assisi without causing subsequent deprivation to the earth. Though it may seem fantastic, it is nevertheless true that since the 17th century, every human being is, in the Mars sphere, for a time, a Buddhist, a Franciscan, and an immediate follower of Francis of Assisi. Francis has since made only one brief incarnation on earth, but he died in childhood and has not again incarnated. He is intimately linked with the work of Buddha on Mars, however, and is one of his eminent followers. We have thus placed before our souls a picture of what comes to pass through that important conference at the end of the 16th century, which resembled what happened on earth in the 13th century, when Christian Rosenkreuz gathered his faithful around him. Nothing less was accomplished than that it was possible to avert the threatened separation of humanity into two classes, thereby making it possible for men to remain inwardly united. Furthermore, those who are intent upon esoteric development, even though they may be absorbed in practical life, can achieve their goal because the Buddha is working from the sphere of Mars. Those forces that help to promote a healthy esoteric life are also attributable to the work and influence of Buddha. In my book, Knowledge of the Higher Worlds and Its Attainment, I have dealt with the methods that are appropriate for meditation today. The essential point is that in Rosicrucian training development is such that one is not torn away from the earthly activities demanded of him by karma. Rosicrucian esoteric development can proceed without causing the slightest disturbance in any situation or occupation. Because Christian Rosenkreuz was able to transfer the work of Buddha from the earth to Mars, it has become possible for the influences of Buddha to pour down to men from outside the earth. Again, then, we have heard of one of the spiritual deeds of Christian Rosenkreuz, but to understand those deeds of the 13th and 16th centuries, we must find our way to their esoteric meaning and significance. It would be good if people were to realize how entirely consistent the progress of theosophy has been in the West since the founding of the Middle European section of the Theosophical Society. Here in Switzerland, lecture courses have been given on the Four Gospels. The substance of all these lectures is contained in a rudimentary form in my book, Christianity as Mystical Fact, written 12 years ago. The book, Knowledge of the Higher Worlds and Its Attainment, describes the Western path of development that is compatible with practical activities of every kind. Today I have indicated that a basic factor in these matters is the mission assigned to Gautama Buddha by Christian Rosenkreuz, and I have spoken of the significant influence that the transference of Buddha to Mars made possible in our solar system. So stone after stone fits into its proper place in our Western theosophy. It has been built up consistently and in obedience to a principle Everything that comes later harmonizes with what went before. Inner consistency is essential in any conception of the world if it is to stand upon the ground of truth. Those who are able to draw near to Christian Rosenkreuz see with wondering veneration by what consistent paths he has carried through the mission entrusted to him. In our time, this is the Rosicrucian Christian path of development. That the Buddha, the exalted teacher of Nirvana, is now fulfilling a mission outside the earth on Mars is also one of the wise and consistent deeds of Christian Rosenkreuz. And this was From Buddha to Christ, 5 lectures by Rudolf Steiner.